Chapter 4151. The ruler of the soul-shaking dominion was sitting in his study with a gloomy face. The attitude of the Western Road army was very tough. He had no choice but to surrender. However, he could not get any benefits. He still had to carry out the task ordered by the Rebel Alliance and bear the anger and revenge of the Imperial Tutor. While the Western Road army was gone, he could complain alone in the study. After complaining, he still had to carry out the order and restore the freedom of the people of the soul-shaking dominion as soon as possible. However, to the ruler of the soul-shaking dominion's surprise, 2 guards rushed to him and reported that the Western Road army was back. Moreover, the Western Road army was fully armed. It seemed that they were fighting someone and were driven back. What? They're back? And they were driven back? The ruler of the soul-shaking dominion was a little dumbfounded. He asked in confusion, "They just came out of the arcane land. How could they be driven back? Who drove them back?" The guard did not know either. He could only shake his head blankly. At this time, another guard rushed into the study and shouted anxiously, "My lord, bad news. The Western Road army is being hunted down. Gather all the people immediately and fight side by side with them to resist the enemy's attack." What? They're really being hunted down? The ruler of the soul-shaking dominion's face changed dramatically. He stood up suddenly. He frowned and his eyes flickered. In a flash, he vaguely guessed who was chasing the Western Road army. Now on the boundless heaven continent, only the Imperial Tutor's soldiers have the strength and motive to chase the Western Road army. Don't tell me they're really coming? Thinking of this, the ruler of the soul-shaking dominion's mood became heavier. He rushed out of the study and ordered, "Pass down the order. Gather all the guards and be on full alert." He was not sure what had happened. Naturally, he would not let his soldiers fight. However, the situation was complicated. He had to let his soldiers be on full alert in case something unexpected happened. Soon, the ruler of the soul-shaking dominion left the study and rushed to the conference hall. At this time, thousands of soldiers of the Western Road army had gathered in the square outside the conference hall. Clan leader Wanyan and a few other clan leaders as well as many god kings rushed into the main hall. Seeing the Soul Shock Domain Lord appear, the patriarchs hurriedly called out to him and gave him orders. "Soul-shaking Region Lord, quickly gather your troops and prepare for battle." "Soul Shock Domain Lord, why are you so slow? Get your soldiers to assemble." For a long time, the patriarchs of the ancient clans had a sense of superiority that came from the bottom of their hearts. They believed that they were nobler than the domain lords. Therefore, they had a condescending attitude towards the various region masters. Now they belonged to the Rebel Alliance and were the generals of the Western Army. They had just forced the soul-shaking domain master to surrender, so they had no qualms about giving orders to him. However, soul-shaking area master was very unhappy. He ignored the other clan leaders and went straight to clan leader Wanyan. He asked, "Clan leader Wanyan, what happened? Who are you being hunted by?" Clan leader Wanyan didn't beat around the bush and directly replied, "The great commander of internal affairs and Kanglan Immortal led 8,000 elites to attack. Startling Soul Region Lord, you've already joined our alliance. It's time for you to show your loyalty." In fact, clan leader Wanyan said this to test soul-shaking area master's loyalty and also to remind him. Clan leader Wanyan still believed that Kenshin must be secretly observing. If soul-shaking area master made a mistake and made the wrong choice, then he would be in big trouble. Unexpectedly, soul-shaking area master was stunned. His eyes widened and he stared at clan leader Wanyan in disbelief. The great commander of internal affairs and Kanglan Immortal? 8,000 elite soldiers? Are they the army sent by the Imperial Tutor to intercept and kill you? When did this happen? Why did it happen to me? Soul-shaking area master was so shocked that he blurted out his inner thoughts subconsciously. In fact, he didn't care whether the Western army could survive or not. He just felt unlucky, aggrieved and depressed. Why did this kind of thing happen to his domain lord manor? Clan leader Wanyan didn't say much. He just patted soul-shaking area master on the shoulder and gave him a meaningful look. "Don't be in a daze. Carry out the order quickly." He was already being extremely benevolent by reminding her to this extent. If soul-shaking area master still didn't know what was good for him, then he had no one to blame but himself. Soul-shaking area master's expression became extremely ugly. He slowly turned to look in the direction of the entrance of the arcane realm. When he saw thousands of soldiers of the Western punitive expedition in the sky thousands of miles away, he felt as if he had been struck by lightning. It turned out that clan leader Wanyan didn't lie to him. There were indeed 8,000 elite soldiers coming to attack and were about to surround his domain lord manor. Not only the Western army, but he was also in big trouble. What should he do? Was it too late to escape now? This was the first thought that came to soul-shaking area master's mind. However, as soon as this thought flashed through his mind, he immediately sobered up. There was no way he could escape from the 8,000 elite soldiers surrounding his domain lord manor. Clan leader Wanyan and more than 2,000 soldiers of the Western army were watching his every move. If he didn't save them and fled at the last minute, the Western army would definitely report it to Kenshin. So far there hadn't been a traitor in the rebel alliance. No one knew what the consequences of violating the oath of surrender would be or how the Kenshin would punish the traitor. However, soul-shaking area master didn't want to try and take the risk. After hesitating for a moment, he said to clan leader Wanyan, "Clan leader Wanyan, I've just ordered the soldiers to gather. Once they've gathered, I'll follow your orders and assist you in the battle." Soul-shaking area master was still sober and knew what to do. Moreover, this battle was obviously going to be lost. If he handed over the command to clan leader Wanyan, he could just cooperate and avoid punishment. Even if the entire army was wiped out and only the divine kings escaped, he wouldn't be punished by Kenshin in the future. Of course, at this critical moment, clan leader Wanyan couldn't be bothered to point out his little scheme. Soon, more than 2,000 soldiers of the Western army formed a battle formation outside the domain lord manor, ready to fight to the death. 8,000 soldiers of the Western army also came and surrounded the domain lord manor. The huge encirclement surrounded the dozens of mountains and thousands of people of the domain lord manor. The 2,000 soldiers under soul-shaking area master's command had finally gathered. Under the command of soul-shaking area master, these soldiers joined the battle. Some of them operated the array while others formed the battle formation. The two sides were in a stalemate, ready to fight at any time. At this moment, the commander of internal affairs and Kanglan Immortal walked out of the crowd and looked down at clan leader Wanyan and soul-shaking area master with a sinister smile. Chapter 4152. Although the two sides had met in the previous ambush, Lin Mingya and Lin Mingya had met each other in the last ambush. There was nothing much to say when they met again this time. They just had to kill. After all, everyone was well aware of each other's intentions and situation. But it was slightly different this time. After all, it was in the soul-shaking domain master's manor, and the soul-shaking domain master was involved. Therefore, the commander of internal affairs had to show his face and say a few words to the soul-shaking domain master. "Soul-shaking domain master, you should have seen me before, right?" The commander of internal affairs ignored clan leader Wanyan and the others. He stared straight at the soul-shaking domain master with a cold smile. The soul-shaking domain master immediately became the focus of everyone's attention. Under the gaze of countless people, he subconsciously took a step back. He had no choice. He was sandwiched between the Imperial Tutor's faction and the Kenshin's faction. He was the weakest and had the least choice. In the face of the commander of internal affairs questioning, he could only choose to remain silent. The commander of internal affairs continued. "His Majesty the God Emperor and the Imperial Tutor treated you well. They gave you the position of domain master and let you reap a lot of benefits. But you failed to live up to the trust of the God Emperor and the Imperial Tutor. You actually became a traitor. Unfortunately, I'm going to make an example of you today. I'm going to kill you and all the soldiers under your command. This is the so-called killing the chicken to warn the monkey. I'm going to let those who have bad intentions and waver see that this is the result of betraying the God Emperor and the Imperial Tutor." The soul-shaking domain master's face suddenly turned pale. Cold sweat broke out on his forehead and deep fear and despair flashed in his eyes. If he really wanted to surrender to the commander of internal affairs. It didn't matter if the soldiers under his command were killed as long as he could survive. But he had just turned to the Rebel Alliance today and swore an oath of surrender. If he changed sides now, he would definitely become the laughingstock of the world. What's more, the commander of internal affairs might not accept his surrender. He would still kill him to show his power. At that time, even his death would be worthless and meaningless. After death, he would be spurned by the world. Therefore, Soul Shock Domain Lord chose to endure the attack with all his might. He braced himself and pretended to be righteous as he said loudly, "Chief Commander, even if you have the advantage, even if I die here today, I will not surrender. That's because I've long wanted to abolish slavery and return freedom to the common people. It's just that I'm alone and weak, so I don't dare to voice my thoughts. Since there are Kenshin raising their arms and calling for the brave resistance against the God Emperor and the Imperial Tutor to save the people of the world, I will naturally follow their orders. As the ruler of a region, it is my duty to plead for the people. Even if I die, it's worth it." Sure enough, the soul-shaking domain lord's words made everyone's blood boil. Thousands of soldiers were moved. Regardless of whether his words came from the bottom of his heart, the fact that he said it in front of everyone meant that he had made his stand clear. The great commander of internal affairs didn't say anything else. He sneered and said, "Very good. Since you still have some backbone, I'll give you a dignified death." As soon as he finished speaking, he waved his hand and gave the order to attack. The 8,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition, who had been ready for a long time, immediately let out an earth-shattering roar. They performed their divine powers in unison and attacked the Domain Lord's manor from all sides. Suddenly, tens of thousands of divine powers covered the sky and the entire Domain Lord's manor. 2,000 guards of the Domain Lord's manor and 2,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition were all covered by the divine light. Countless people looked worried, anxious, and pessimistic. Their hearts were heavy. They all knew that there was no hope of winning this battle. However, it was useless to be pessimistic. Even if they knew that they were no match for the enemy, they couldn't just sit and wait. They had to fight back with all their might. Clan leader Wanyan, the other clan leaders, and the soul-shaking domain lord took the lead and rushed out. They shouted and performed their divine powers to resist the enemy's fierce attacks. Influenced by their momentum, the soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition and the 2,000 guards of the Domain Lord's manor also became excited and united. Thousands of warriors with a solemn and resolute mood performed their ultimate skills with all their strength and launched a counterattack. The first round of battle between the two sides had begun. Boom, 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 boom. Deafening noises exploded between heaven and earth, causing the earth to tremble. The divine light in the sky collided violently and collapsed on the spot, bursting into billions of fragments. The violent and raging shockwaves hit the Domain Lord's manor and the mountains and rivers within a radius of 30,000 miles. The defensive array of the Domain Lord's manor had been activated. However, the layers of mediocre king-level divine array could not withstand the shockwaves of more than 10,000 experts. It only lasted for 2 breaths before it shattered. The first round of battle ended with casualties on both sides. However, the casualties on the Western Punitive Expedition's side were relatively light. Only a little more than 100 people were killed and 200 were injured. On the other hand, more than 300 guards of the Western Punitive Expedition and the Domain Lord's manor were killed and nearly 700 were injured on the spot. It was only the first round of battle, but the Western Punitive Expedition and the Domain Lord's manor had suffered such heavy casualties. This showed how big the gap in strength between the two sides was. In particular, the Western Punitive Expedition had destroyed the defensive array of the Domain Lord's manor in the first round of battle. This was very unfavorable for the Western Punitive Expedition and the Domain Lord's manor. Now that they had lost a layer of protection, their casualties were bound to be greater. More than 4,000 soldiers were filled with worry and despair. The various clan leaders and the Domain Lord's manor lord were also nervous. They were secretly thinking about how to deal with this and when they could find a way to escape. Clan leader Wanyan was the only one with the most complicated feelings. He pretended to be calm and collected, but his heart was full of doubts. He secretly looked around. He wondered if his prediction was wrong. Did the Kenshin not come? So, did it mean that he had guessed wrong from the beginning? Or, did the Kenshin think that these casualties were nothing and that it was not time to strike? If it was the latter, clan leader Wanyan could accept it. However, if it was the former, then he was very disappointed and desperate. The Western Punitive Expedition's morale was greatly boosted. They shouted and launched the second round of attack. More than 7,000 soldiers brandished their swords. The Kenshin soldiers were murderous as they cast divine spells and released divine light illusions that blotted out the sky. The Western Punitive Expedition and the Domain Lord's manor guards, who were about to be drowned by the divine light, could only anxiously and desperately use their trump cards. Everyone knew that it was useless. It was still impossible to stop the siege of the Western punitive expedition. At most, it could only delay the speed of their defeat. However, at this point they had no other choice. The divine light flood was about to engulf the Western punitive expedition and the Domain Lord's manor guards. In the second round of battle they would definitely lose more soldiers. The number of survivors would drop to about 3,000. Next, everyone could imagine that in less than 15 minutes, the Western punitive expedition and the Domain Lord's manor would be killed and destroyed. However, at this moment of life and death, a scene that no one had expected occurred. A handsome young man in a white robe suddenly appeared in the sky above the Domain Lord's manor. Chapter 4153. Who would dare to barge into a battlefield where tens of thousands of people were fighting? There were only two possibilities. Either they were stupid enough to court death or they were unbelievably strong. That handsome young man with a mysterious and dignified aura was obviously the latter. There were only a handful of people in the world who dared to ignore the simultaneous attacks of thousands of experts. Other than the 5 god emperors, there was only one person who could do it. When everyone looked up at the white-robed young man, a name appeared in their minds. Hey, that's right, only he could do it. Even if the imperial tutor was a peak divine king, he couldn't do it. Even though most of them had never seen Kenshin's face with their own eyes. But the commander of internal affairs, Kanglin Immortal clan leader Wan Yan, and the other clan leaders had all seen Ji Tianxing before. The moment they recognized Ji Tianxing, everyone was shocked and had different expressions on their faces. Clan leader Wan Yan was pleasantly surprised at first, then he revealed a smile that said, "It's just as I expected." His face was filled with gratification and pride. The other clan leaders were pleasantly surprised at first, then they heaved a sigh of relief, their hearts finally settling back into their stomachs. They didn't dare to believe it, nor did they understand why Kenshin would appear here. Didn't Kenshin already say that he wouldn't help the Western army? But at this moment they didn't have time to think so much. They only knew that since Kenshin was here the Western army was safe. And the 8,000 soldiers of the Western expedition, the commander of internal affairs and Kanglin Immortal were all doomed. As for the commander of internal affairs and Kanglin Immortal, they were filled with shock and couldn't believe what they were seeing. The same thought flashed through their minds at the same time. Kenshin? How can it be him? Isn't he leading the northern army to attack the city? How can he be here? This can't be real, this must be an illusion. Neither of them could accept this reality. Of course, everyone's reactions happened at the same time in an instant. At this moment Ji Tianxing was doing something that left everyone dumbfounded. He actually opened his arms and his body lit up with divine light. He erupted with his most powerful divine power and began to use his divine ability. He stood between the two sides facing the 7,000 soldiers of the Western expedition alone. He actually wanted to resist and dissolve the attack of the Western expedition army with his own strength. With his own strength he could resist the joint attack of more than 7,000 people. This was definitely a feat that shocked everyone's heart and made their jaws dropped. Whoosh, whoosh. Ji Tianxing released a 5-colored light screen that spanned thousands of miles. It was like a giant whirlpool that spanned across the sky. The divine art of the Western Expedition Army to attack of the divine ability of the Western Expedition Army. Under everyone's shocked gaze, the divine light that blotted out the sky merged into the huge colorful vortex and turned into a huge ball of light. That solid, multicolored ball of light was at least 10,000 meters wide like a small hill. Whoosh. Ji Tianxing turned his body slightly and pushed his hands behind him. Suddenly, the 5-colored vortex dissipated, and the mountain-sized 5-colored ball of light blasted into the distant sky like a cannonball. Boom. Crack. In the next moment, a huge hole was blasted in the sky tens of thousands of miles away, revealing a dark void. The 5-colored ball of light blasted into the void and disappeared. Just like that, the joint attack of the 7,000 soldiers of the Western Expedition Army was easily neutralized by Ji Tianxing. Such a move could only be described as divine. More than 10,000 people on the battlefield were dumbfounded. They stood rooted to the ground like statues. The battle paused just like that. After a while, everyone came back to their senses and let out excited cheers and exclamations. The Western Expedition Army looked terrified and worried, while the Western Expedition Army and the guards of the domain chief's manor were overjoyed. They were so excited that their blood was boiling. The Wanyan clan leader stroked his beard with a smile and commented, as expected of the peerless Kenshin. Today I have seen Kenshin's moves with my own eyes. It is truly amazing. Ancient sayings once said that martial arts techniques could be used to deflect or borrow the force of others' attacks. Kenshin used this move in his divine power. It is truly amazing. The other clan leaders nodded in agreement. They were not stingy with their praises for Kenshin. Kenshin's peerless reputation was earned through battle after battle. How can it be fake? Kenshin is the first person in history to be able to neutralize the joint attack of 7,000 soldiers alone. Not to mention Lord Alliance leader's strength and methods, just his domineering and heroic spirit of looking down on the world and surpassing everyone else is unparalleled. Deflecting 1,000 caddies with 4 tails? That's not quite accurate. If the 7,000 soldiers of the Western Expedition Army were 1,000 caddies, we are only deflecting 4 tails. Lord Kenshin is at least 500 caddies, right? That's right. That's absolutely right. Even if Kenshin did not use any clever means to neutralize the attack, he could still block it head-on. The army on the Western Road was jubilant. The soul-shaking domain master and his guards also looked relieved and completely at ease. Everyone felt that since Kenshin had appeared, there was nothing for them to do. Kenshin alone could kill all 8,000 soldiers of the Western Expedition Army. This sounded absurd, but to the sword god, it was as simple as eating a meal. It was a piece of cake. The Internal Affairs Commander and Kanglin Immortal were also in a mess. Their previous confidence and domineering attitude had disappeared. Their faces became very ugly. The two of them were uneasy. They were in awe and fear of Kenshin's power and means. If it were not for the tens of thousands of people watching, they would have turned around and fled. Unfortunately, no matter how flustered they were, they had to maintain a dignified posture. They could not show their fear. Otherwise, the morale of the 7,000 soldiers would be affected and they would collapse without a fight. Kenshin, you clearly led the Northern Army to attack the city. How could you appear here? Kanglin Immortal frowned as he stared at Ji Tianxing and asked in a low voice. Ji Tianxing glanced at him and showed a playful smile. Not long ago someone asked me the same question, but he died soon after. Such an answer made Kanglin Immortal and the Internal Affairs Commander's expression change. That was because they all knew who Ji Tianxing was talking about. The Internal Affairs Commander frowned and thought for a moment. He immediately guessed the answer and asked with a dark expression. Kenshin, you must have used a doppelganger technique and left a doppelganger in the Northern Army to confuse us and make us make the wrong judgment. As for your true self, you have already secretly rushed over and joined up with the Western Army, am I right? Ji Tianxing smiled and nodded. That's right. You've guessed it right. Chapter 4154. In fact, the patriarchs of the Western Army and the ruler of the soul-shaking territory did not understand what was going on. From what they knew, Kenshin had always been in the Northern Army and could not have appeared here. Moreover, Patriarch Wanyan had told them that Kenshin clearly said that he did not have time and would not support them. At that time, the patriarchs were depressed and disappointed, thinking that Kenshin was biased and did not care about their lives. Now, after listening to the Internal Affairs Commander's analysis, they finally understood the truth. Immediately, the patriarchs felt somewhat ashamed. They blamed themselves and felt guilty for their misunderstanding of the sword god. The truth is that Kenshin did not care about our lives. We are also members of the Rebel Alliance. How could he let us be destroyed? I was thinking that we were ambushed and suffered heavy losses. Of course, it was a disgrace to the Rebel Alliance. With Kenshin's status and identity, how could he swallow this humiliation? Now the truth is out. Kenshin deliberately spread the news that he would not support us to deceive the Western Punitive Army and make them lower their guard. The Western Punitive Army was also afraid that Kenshin would support us, so they did not dare to make a move for so long. Not long ago, 2 of our deacons disappeared for no reason. It was definitely the work of the Western Punitive Army. The Western Punitive Army captured the 2 deacons and found out that Kenshin would not help them, so they decided to ambush us. That's right. Your analysis is absolutely correct. Kenshin guessed the Internal Affairs Commander's thoughts and plans and set up this trap in advance to lure the Western Punitive Army to kill us. He knew that the Internal Affairs Commander and the Imperial Tutor were cautious and suspicious. Not only did they deliberately spread the news, but they also left a clone in the Northern Army to show his face in front of everyone. All of this was to make the Western Punitive Army lower their guard. Not only is Kenshin's swordsmanship unparalleled, but his shrewdness and schemes are also amazing. That's right. We can only blame ourselves for being too shallow and ignorant. We wronged him. Just thinking about it makes me feel ashamed. The patriarchs discussed telepathically and quickly analyzed the cause and effect. They also understood Kenshin's plan and thought process. As a result, everyone's resentment towards Kenshin dissipated and turned into shame, gratitude, and admiration. Even though the great commander of internal affairs and inextinguishable Kanglin were nervous, the 7,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition were also under great pressure. Their hearts were filled with fear and awe. However, in the current situation he was already riding a tiger and had no way to back down. The Minister of Internal Affairs knew that the Western Punitive Expedition could only advance and could not retreat. At the very least they could not retreat without a fight. Otherwise, the morale of the Western Punitive Expedition Army would collapse on the spot and they would be chased down by the Western Punitive Expedition Army. Not to mention the fact that they could not escape the Kenshin's pursuit. Even if they could escape, they would face the Imperial Tutor's disappointment and punishment. After this defeat, the morale of the Imperial Tutor's army would be completely shattered. Since the Imperial Tutor, there was no one else who could lead an army into battle. Therefore, the Minister of Internal Affairs could only shout against his will to boost the morale of the Western Punitive Expedition. Officers and soldiers, you are all carefully selected by the Imperial Tutor and me. You are the real elites and mighty masters. Although everyone knows that the Kenshin is a peerless powerhouse and is famous for his fighting prowess, we should not be afraid. In today's battle we should not be timid or afraid. We should be proud and excited. Think about it, to be able to fight a bloody battle with the Kenshin. Isn't that an honor for us? No matter how strong the Kenshin is, we have 7,000 soldiers. As long as everyone fights to the death, we will definitely be able to defeat the enemy. Everyone, don't worry. I will fight alongside you until the last moment. I will not retreat even if I die. His powerful voice reverberated in the sky, deafening everyone's ears. The 7,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition Army were affected by the Minister of Internal Affairs' aura. Their blood was boiling and their fighting spirit was soaring. They also waved the divine weapons in their hands, shouting and roaring excitedly. Their bodies were filled with blazing fighting spirit. Seeing this, Ji Tianxing raised an eyebrow and his lips curled into a playful smile. Although the great commander of internal affairs appeared to be majestic and impassioned, the great commander of internal affairs' thoughts could not be hidden from him. He had already guessed what the Minister of Internal Affairs was going to do next. Therefore he secretly transmitted an order to the Wanyan clan leader and the others. Half of the soldiers will follow me into battle and destroy the Western Punitive Expedition Army as soon as possible. The other half will immediately leave the domain chief's manor and rush to the entrance of the secret territory. Kill the Western Punitive Expedition Army guarding there and control the entrance as soon as possible. The Wanyan clan leader immediately gave the order to assign tasks. Under his command, the Wanyan clan and the other two clans stayed behind to fight. The other two clans and the guards under the domain chief's command rushed to the entrance of the secret territory. Seeing them fly across the sky and rush to the entrance of the secret territory, the 7,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition Army had complicated expressions on their faces. Just a moment ago they were aggressive and had an overwhelming advantage. They could look down on the Western Punitive Expedition Army and the guards of the domain chief's manor. But now the Western Punitive Expedition Army, backed by Kenshin, had ignored them and directly attacked the Western Punitive Expedition Army guarding the entrance of the secret territory. Although there were only about 1,000 soldiers left on the battlefield, they were all full of fighting spirit and confidence. They looked like they could easily crush the Western Punitive Expedition Army. There was no other reason other than the presence of Kenshin. The Minister of Internal Affairs saw that the situation was not good. Not only was the morale of his army declining, but the 1,000 soldiers guarding the entrance were also in danger. He quickly waved his divine sword and gave the order to attack. Kill. The 7,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition Army had been ready for a long time. When they heard the Minister of Internal Affairs' order, they immediately let out a deafening roar and took the lead in attacking. Another dazzling divine light shone. The divine light covered the sky and the sun, covering a radius of 20,000 miles. The Western Punitive Expedition Army's morale was high. The Minister of Internal Affairs and Kanglin Immortal also joined the battle and attacked Ji Tianxing with all their might. Their goal was clear. With the two of them as the leader and 20 divine kings, they would join forces to besiege Ji Tianxing. They did not expect to kill Ji Tianxing on the spot. As long as they could delay him, that would be enough. The remaining 7,000 soldiers would be able to kill the 1,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition Army very quickly. The Minister of Internal Affairs' plan was very clear. This plan was indeed feasible. But the problem was, he had absolutely no idea how formidable Ji Tianxing's strength was. Moreover, Ji Tianxing seemed to be alone, but he actually had a group of divine kings with him. Swoosh! Ji Tianxing opened the Jiutian 10 Absolutes Pagoda, and a blazing door of light appeared beside him. The next moment, Yun Yao, Ji Ku, Chao Qingyu, Lon, Yang, Bai Feng, Lin Shui, and the others appeared. The 12 God King powerhouses were prepared long ago. As soon as they appeared, they waved their divine weapons and joined the battle. Their goal was very clear. They were to help the 1,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition Army resist the encirclement of the 7,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition Army. They did not need to kill the Western Punitive Expedition Army. They just needed to hold them off for a moment. Chapter 4155. There were more than 8,000 people on both sides and they started to fight again. The great commander of internal affairs and Kanglin Immortal led 20 God King experts to besiege Ji Tianxing in the sky. These 22 God Kings feared Ji Tianxing's fame and strength from the bottom of their hearts. Therefore they didn't hold back at all when they attacked, using their trump card divine abilities. Everyone released all kinds of destructive divine techniques, which poured down like a torrential flood, drowning Ji Tianxing's figure. Ji Tianxing didn't hesitate. He immediately used the divine skill of 10 directional shadows and created 8 doppelgangers. The reason why he created 8 doppelgangers instead of 9 was because he left one doppelganger in the army on the north to act as a cover to deceive the Imperial Tutor and the Western Expedition Army. Whoosh whoosh whoosh. Ji Tianxing and the 8 doppelgangers spread out and used all kinds of divine skills and sword Dao skills at the same time to fight the commander of internal affairs and the others. The crisscrossing divine light phantoms flashed in the sky, and a series of earth-shattering noises reverberated. Violent shockwaves spread out in all directions along with countless fragments of divine light. The domain chief's manor, which was closest to the battle, was naturally unlucky. The mountains and dozens of palaces and mansions within 1,000 miles were flattened by the shockwaves and turned into a mess of ruins. Fortunately, before the battle began, the domain chief of the soul-shaking domain had asked more than 3,000 family members and servants to leave the domain chief's manor and hide in the depths of the mystic realm. Otherwise, the 3,000 people would have died in vain if the domain chief's manor was destroyed by the shockwaves. After 3 moves, Ji Tianxing gained the upper hand. The commander of internal affairs, Kanglin Immortal, and the 20 God Kings couldn't hurt Ji Tianxing no matter how hard they tried. On the other hand, Ji Tianxing's divine skills could always break through their defenses and injure them one by one. In a short span of 10 breaths, 2 God Kings had been killed by Ji Tianxing after exchanging over 20 blows. The other 9 divine king powerhouses were also injured by Ji Tianxing's clones, their bodies bathed in blood. In the sky, Ji Tianxing held the upper hand and the advantage. He attacked in the most violent manner, trying to finish off the internal affairs commander and the others as quickly as possible. In the sky and on the ground, Yun Yao, Ji Ku, and the others were helping nearly 1,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition Army to resist the encirclement of 7,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition Army. Even though they were all God King experts with extraordinary strength and were proficient in all kinds of divine abilities and ultimate arts, their battle prowess was outstanding. However, the West Punitive Expedition Army outnumbered them by 7 to 1. No matter how powerful they were, it was impossible for them to tie with the West Punitive Expedition Army. Other than the 5 God Emperors and Ji Tianxing, almost no one could accomplish such a miracle. After the 2 sides fought for 10 breaths of time, the Western Army fell into a difficult situation. They kept shrinking their defensive circle and moving became difficult. Of the 1,100 soldiers, more than 200 were injured and more than 60 were killed. Yun Yao, Ji Ku and the others were worried, but they did not panic. They continued to deal with the situation calmly. In order to slow down the collapse of the Western army and buy as much time as possible, they used their trump cards and life-saving divine artifacts. For example, Ji Ku controlled the 9 Heavens 10 Absolutes pagoda to block most of the attacks. This move was indeed effective. Although it could not completely prevent the Western army from dying, it could at least significantly reduce the casualties. The earth-shattering battle lasted for 100 breaths of time before it reached its most intense moment. The surrounding tens of thousands of miles had become a battlefield. The mountains and rivers were destroyed and the battlefield was littered with corpses and flesh. The battle between Ji Tianxing and the Internal Affairs Commander and the others was about to come to an end. The Internal Affairs Commander and Kanglin Immortal were both injured. Their clothes were tattered and their bodies were covered in blood. They looked rather miserable. Ji Tianxing had also killed more than half of the 20 intermediate and high-level god kings. Only 8 of them were still alive, but they were also severely injured. On the other hand, Ji Tianxing and his 8 clones were safe and sound. None of them were injured. After all, Ji Tianxing's true strength was more than 10 times that of an ordinary peak god king. Each of his doppelgangers had half of his strength, which was several times that of a peak god king. As for the Internal Affairs Commander, Kanglin Immortal and the 20 god kings, none of them were peak god kings. The 2 strongest were only 9th heaven god kings. No matter what divine abilities or techniques they used, they would not be able to hurt Ji Tianxing. Unknowingly, another 30 breaths of time passed. The 8 severely injured god kings were also killed by Ji Tianxing and his 8 doppelgangers. They died tragically on the spot. Only the Internal Affairs Commander and Kanglin Immortal were still alive. However, their injuries had worsened and their combat strength had decreased greatly. Both of them were filled with fear. They were very afraid of Ji Tianxing's strength and techniques. If they continued to fight, the 2 of them would die under Ji Tianxing's sword in less than 50 breaths of time. Hence, the 2 of them very tacitly chose to turn around and flee. This was originally the plan that the 2 of them already decided on before the battle began. Taking advantage of the time when the battle was at its most intense, under the situation where the soldiers were not paying attention, the 2 of them fled quietly. The chances of success were very high. It was just that they did not expect that Ji Tianxing's strength was too horrifying, killing off all 20 god kings so quickly. As such, the 2 of them felt that it was too late to escape now. The chances of success were not high. Whoosh, whoosh. Taking advantage of the time when Ji Tianxing fired out 2 rays of fist light, blasting them out 1,000 miles away, the 2 of them immediately borrowed the force to retreat, turning around and fleeing towards the Mystic Realm's exit. Even if they were injured by the shock, blood spewing out of their noses and mouths, in order to not attract the soldiers' attention, the 2 of them forcefully endured it and did not make a sound. Furthermore, in order to increase the chances of successfully escaping, the 2 of them even teleported in 2 different directions respectively, pulling apart a distance of 20,000 miles in a blink of an eye. If it was outside the Mystic Realm and there was only Ji Tianxing alone, then their scheme still had a chance of success. Regardless of which one Ji Tianxing chased, the other would escape. But now, everyone was inside the soul-shaking Mystic Realm. No matter how the Internal Affairs Commander and Navy Tide Immortals split up to escape, they still had to pass through the Mystic Realm's exit. Most importantly, Ji Tianxing was not alone, he still had 8 clones. Each doppelganger had the ability to defeat and kill the Great Commander of Internal Affairs and Kanglin Immortal. The 8 clones attacked at the same time, splitting into 2 to chase after them, quickly stopping them. Just like that, the Great Commander of Internal Affairs and Deep Tide Immortal were separated from each other and attacked by 4 clones. In less than 20 breaths of time, Navy Tide Immortal was killed by the 4 clones and turned into ashes. Following that, the Internal Affairs Commander also died under the swords of Ji Tianxing and the 4 clones, dying without a complete corpse. Ji Tianxing waved his hand and picked up the 2's godhead fragments, turning around and rushing back to the battlefield. In the battle just now, the 7,000 Western Punitive Expedition Army did not suffer many casualties. Only about 800 people were killed. The Western Punitive Expedition Army suffered heavier casualties. Even with the help of Yun Yao, Ji Ku and the others, more than 400 people were killed, leaving only 700 people alive. Everyone was in a very dangerous situation, even Yunyao, Jiku and the others were injured. However, when Ji Tianxing rushed back to the battlefield and joined the battle, there was no suspense about the outcome. Chapter 4156. More than 6,000 Western Punitive Expedition soldiers surrounded more than 700 Western Punitive Expedition soldiers in Yunyao, completely suppressing them. If it weren't for the supreme-grade divine artifact Jutian Tenju Tower, those 700 people would have been killed long ago. However, after Ji Tianxing joined the battle with his 8 doppelgangers, the situation immediately reversed. The Grand Commander has already escaped and been killed by me. Do you still want to resist? The 8 doppelgangers waved their divine swords and rushed into the battlefield with murderous intent, slaughtering the Western Punitive Expedition soldiers. Ji Tianxing didn't forget to shout as he used his divine ability. His powerful voice covered the sound of the explosions caused by the collision of divine arts, allowing the 6,000 Western Punitive Expedition soldiers to hear it clearly. This sudden news caused the 6,000-plus soldiers to stiffen and their expressions to become extremely ugly. Countless people subconsciously turned to look at Ji Tianxing, or searched the surrounding sky for the Grand Commander of Internal Affairs and Kanglin Immortal. When they saw that the Grand Commander and Kanglin Immortal had indeed disappeared, they immediately panicked. Previously, the Grand Commander of Internal Affairs had said that he would fight side by side with them and would not retreat even if he died. In the end, before the battle had even reached its end, the Grand Commander and Kanglin Immortal had actually escaped. It was one thing to escape, but before he could do so he was killed by the Sword God. What was this? This was too humiliating. This thought flashed through the minds of the thousands of Western Punitive Expedition soldiers. Their morale dropped by more than half, and they felt that there was no point in continuing to fight. There were also some soldiers who fell into hesitation and dilemma, considering whether to continue fighting or surrender to Kenshin. In their opinion, even the Grand Commander of the army had abandoned them and fled, so it was understandable that they would declare their surrender. Moreover, they were surrendering to Kenshin, so losing to Kenshin was not shameful at all. However, the 700 Western Punitive Expedition soldiers, Yunyao, Jiku and the others did not stop attacking. While the 6,000 Western Punitive Expedition soldiers were in a daze, everyone unleashed their divine abilities to counterattack. Boom, 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 bang 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 bang. A deafening explosion erupted, reverberating endlessly between heaven and earth. Under the dazzling divine light, more than 800 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition were killed on the spot. Of course, nearly 500 of them were killed by Ji Tianxing and his doppelganger. With his and his avatar's strength and means, dealing with those Divine Lord Realm Western Punitive Expedition army was simply like chopping vegetables. The heavily injured Western Punitive Expedition army immediately reacted, and many people subconsciously retreated. However, there were still many Divine King generals in the West Punitive Expedition. They were still able to keep their cool and quickly shouted, "Everyone, don't panic. And don't believe Kenshin's nonsense. The chief commander and clan leader Kanglin would never do such a thing. The Kenshin wants to divide us so that they can annihilate us all. Right now, the only thing that can save our lives is ourselves. Don't retreat anymore. Only by breaking out of the encirclement will we have a chance to survive." The shouts of the generals spread through the crowd and calmed the hearts of many soldiers. The panicked Western Punitive Expedition army calmed down and began to methodically counterattack. Everyone knew that the chief commander of Internal Affairs and Kanglin Immortal had most likely been killed because they tried to escape, and that more than 6,000 of them could not escape this fate. But in the midst of despair, there was still a trace of hope and luck in their hearts. The only thing they could do was to fight back with all their strength and search for that trace of light in the darkness. And the result? If the 5,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition army were to escape, the name of the Kenshin would be ruined. With his strength, if he could not even kill these people, how could he take revenge on the 5 god emperors? In just a few minutes, the 5,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition army were slaughtered, and not a single one escaped. 70% of them were killed by Ji Tianxing and his 8 doppelganger, while the remaining 30% were killed by the Western Punitive Expedition army Yunyao, Jiku and the others. After the battle ended, the divine light and loud noises that covered the sky gradually dissipated. Ji Tianxing recalled his 8 doppelganger and let Yun Yao Ji Ku and the others return to the Jiutian 10 Absolutes Tower to recuperate and rest. As for the Wanyan Patriarch and the 700 soldiers, they were also heavily injured. Ji Tianxing let them stay on the battlefield to recuperate and clean up. He turned and left the ruined battlefield alone and rushed to the exit of the soul-shaking secret realm. When Ji Tianxing arrived at the exit of the secret realm, the battle here was about to end. The Western Punitive Expedition Army and the 1,000 guards under the soul-shaking realm's master besieged the 1,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition Army guarding the exit. They had the advantage in numbers and the other side did not have any top experts. The result was obvious. When Ji Tianxing arrived at the exit, 80% of the Western Punitive Expedition Army had been killed. Only about 200 people were left and they were fighting and retreating. These Western Punitive Expedition Army were elite and loyal, but it did not mean that they were stupid. They knew that they were no match for the enemy and that defeat was inevitable. Of course, they would give up the exit of the secret realm and try their best to escape. However, the 2,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition Army chased after them and did not let them go. Ji Tianxing waved his hand again and unleashed sword lights that filled the sky. He used a few divine skills and killed the 200 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition Army. The battle here also came to an end. The disciples of the clans and the 1,000 guards of the soul-shaking realm's master manor heaved a sigh of relief. Ji Tianxing ordered the soul-shaking realm's master, "You take the guards under your command and guard here. Repair the exit array as soon as possible." This was the first time Ji Tianxing spoke to the soul-shaking realm's master. The soul-shaking realm's master was really flattered and quickly nodded. After that, Ji Tianxing led the disciples of the 2 ancient clans back to the ruins of the domain master manor. The people from the 5 clans gathered once again, but the number of people had increased from the initial 4,000 to more than 1,800. Even though the number of soldiers on the Western Front had decreased sharply and they had suffered heavy casualties. However, the main forces and pillars of the various clans were still there. As long as they added some more manpower, it wouldn't be a problem. Ji Tianxing asked the ordinary disciples of the clans to circulate their energy to heal their injuries. He summoned the patriarchs, elders and deacons of the 5 clans. Everyone gathered together and stood respectfully, looking at Ji Tianxing with eyes full of excitement, gratitude and worship. After this battle, their misunderstandings of Ji Tianxing were completely eliminated. At the same time, they were completely convinced by Ji Tianxing's shrewdness, strategy and strength. Ji Tianxing calmly swept his gaze over the crowd and said, "Now that things have come to this, I believe that there is no need for this king to explain any further. Everyone understands this king's strategy and intentions. Before this, perhaps everyone would have some thoughts or even resentment. However, I will use my actions to prove that anyone who joins the alliance will be protected by the alliance. What you're worried about will never happen. After this battle, there is almost no one under the Imperial Tutor's command that can be used. The general situation is set. However, you must learn from this lesson and never let your guard down again." Chapter 4157. It was just as Ji Tianxing had said. Half of the boundless heaven continent was now under the control of the rebel alliance. Today, Ji Tianxing had killed the commander of internal affairs and Kanglin Everlasting. It would be difficult for the Imperial Tutor to find another expert of the same level who he could trust and who had the ability to stand on his own. It was expected that the next attack of the rebel alliance would be unstoppable, and the Imperial Tutor would be helpless. When the disciples of the 5 clans thought of this, they were all excited and full of expectations. But as Ji Tianxing had said with this lesson, they had to be more cautious and not be careless. Although the Kenshin could save them once or twice, it was impossible for them to guard them all day long and save them 3 or 4 times. If they wanted to restore the reputation of the Western Road Army and impress the people of the boundless heaven continent, they had to show their true abilities. And the most important thing was that the clans had to transfer manpower to restore the 4,000 men of the Western Road Army as soon as possible. After Ji Tianxing spoke to the crowd, he gave a few words of advice to clan leader Wanyan before he turned and left. The clan leaders, elders and deacons watched him float away, their hearts filled with excitement and joy. They could not calm down for a long time. When Ji Tianxing flew to the exit of the secret realm, he saw hundreds of seriously injured guards of the domain chief's manor healing their wounds. The soul-shaking domain lord ignored his own injuries and personally led hundreds of guards who were less injured to repair the grand formation at the exit. Noticing Ji Tianxing's arrival, the soul-shaking region's master and the guards hurriedly stopped casting and bowed respectfully. Ji Tianxing glanced at the domain chief and nodded slightly. "You're not bad. Keep working hard and don't let me down." After saying this, he left without looking back. But the domain chief was stunned in place, his face full of surprise and pride. A moment later, Ji Tianxing had already left the domain chief and disappeared into the sky. Only then did the domain chief come back to his senses. He pointed at himself proudly and said excitedly, "Did you see that? Hey, Kenshin spoke to me alone just now. He praised and encouraged me. Kenshin will remember me." The soul-shaking domain lord, who had always been solemn and dignified, was now as happy as a child. He was so excited that it was as if he had won a heaven-shaking prize. However, the guards beside him did not feel strange or awkward. They all nodded in agreement as they felt the same way. They were also a little excited as they exclaimed and praised him. "The domain lord is going to soar. This means that His Excellency's heroic performance has caught the eye of Kenshin. The region lord is mighty." To be able to obtain Kenshin's recognition and praise is definitely something that countless experts dream of. Although they knew that the guards were flattering him, they were also excited, envious, and amazed from the bottom of their hearts. Therefore, the soul-shaking domain lord was very happy and felt that the risk he had taken was worth it. After Ji Tianxing left the soul-shaking domain, he boarded the Godslayer battleship and rushed back to meet up with the Northern Army. At this time, his clone was still leading the Northern Army and was still conquering one region after another. Anyway, his clone also had the strength of a peak divine king. No one could tell if it was real or fake. Moreover, wherever the Northern Army went, those domain lords could not help but surrender when they heard the name of Kenshin. Who would dare to resist? 4 days later, Ji Tianxing met up with the Northern Army and withdrew his clone. Everything returned to normal. The Rebel Alliance's expansion did not stop. At this time, the news of the 8,000 Western punitive army besieging the Western Army but being completely annihilated by Kenshin in the soul-shaking secret realms spread again. This kind of major event in war was already very eye-catching. In addition, the Sword God had personally made a move, appearing and disappearing like a ghost. He had miraculously annihilated 8,000 soldiers of the Western punitive expedition, causing a huge commotion. For a time, the various regions of the boundless heaven continent were discussing and praising this matter. Not only the top powerhouses and factions, but even the hundreds of millions of civilians knew that Kenshin had once again created a miracle. As the related news spread, the cause, process, and twists of the matter were all restored. When the people of the boundless heaven continent knew about Kenshin's intentions and plans, they could not help but praise and respect him. At the same time, there was also a very influential rumor circulating on the continent. Kenshin has figured out the Imperial Tutor's nature and thoughts. He can already predict the future and guess the Imperial Tutor's movements and plans. In addition, the Rebel Alliance has taken over half of the continent. Kenshin's strength is also unparalleled. They are invincible below the 5 God Emperors. Obviously, Kenshin has completely grasped the initiative and the advantage. The Imperial Tutor is helpless and can only wait for his death. This rumor was the conclusion of some top powerhouses and divine kings based on what happened in the past 6 months. And this conclusion received the support and affirmation of hundreds of millions of people. At least 80% of the people on the boundless heaven continent were certain that the Rebel Alliance would win for sure. Kenshin would definitely unify the entire continent. The Imperial Tutor would definitely be defeated and the speed would be very fast. Perhaps it would be soon. Similar rumors spread wildly on the boundless heaven continent, causing everyone to know about it. Therefore, the territories and civilians that had already belonged to the Rebel Alliance were naturally overjoyed and full of anticipation. The other half had not been subdued and was still under the control of the Imperial Tutor. It was a bleak and depressing scene. Even the tens of thousands of soldiers stationed in the Dark Knight domain became demoralized and dispirited. There were even deserters among the soldiers. Some soldiers quietly left the troops and disappeared without a trace. There were not many of these soldiers. They were divided into countless small teams and their strength was more scattered. After they fled the Dark Knight domain, it was impossible for them to join the Rebel Alliance. But in their view, if they could leave the army under the imperial tutor as soon as possible, they could also save their lives in the future. Unknowingly, another month had passed. The development of the matter was just like the rumors circulating in the boundless heaven continent. The 5 clans of the Western Army transferred many of their disciples and recovered to 4,000 people. The rebel alliance's power did not weaken. Instead, its prestige increased. The 4 armies rushed about non-stop, successively subduing one territory after another. Today, 64 territories had already been subdued by the rebel alliance and were under the command of the Kenshin. Most of the territorial masters of these territories had joined the rebel alliance and also swore to be loyal to the Kenshin. Only a dozen or so territories had territorial masters who rebelled and were killed by the rebel alliance, and a new territorial master was chosen. Or when the imperial tutor issued the order to assemble, those territorial masters rushed to the Dark Night domain and gave up their territories. At this time, the rebel alliance could be said to be at the peak of its power, and victory was in their grasp. The imperial tutor's faction was suppressed to the point of being unable to breathe. The morale of the army was slack and the territories were constantly shrinking. Finally, the more than 300 god kings and god generals under the imperial tutor could no longer sit still. Chapter 4158. In the past month, there had been constant rumors on the boundless heaven continent, and the situation had been worsening. The rebel alliance had won successive victories and their reputation soared. Naturally, the tens of thousands of soldiers under the imperial tutor were holed up in the Dark Night domain. Although it was said that they were waiting for an opportunity, it felt more like they were waiting for death. The morale of the army was low and more soldiers were running away. The 300 divine kings and generals were worried, but they could not come up with a good plan. Helpless, they gathered together to discuss countermeasures, and finally unanimously decided to meet the imperial tutor. No matter how the outside world described Kenshin as brilliant and unparalleled, and how stupid and stubborn the imperial tutor was described as, in the hearts of these generals and divine kings, the imperial tutor was still their pillar of support for victory and survival. Late at night, the imperial tutor was in his residence as usual, cultivating in the secret chamber. Ever since he learned of a certain secret a few months ago, he had changed from a state of nervousness and anxiety to one of confidence, certainty, and leisure. No one knew why he was so confident and relaxed, and he had never explained the reason to anyone. At this moment, the guard outside the secret chamber reported loudly, "Lord Imperial Tutor, 12 great generals request an audience, and they are waiting for you in this study." The imperial tutor had more than 300 divine kings and divine generals under his command, but it was impossible for all of them to meet the imperial tutor. Therefore they chose 12 divine generals and experts who had the highest status and were the most respectable. The imperial tutor was displeased that his cultivation was interrupted. He frowned and asked in a low voice, "I did not order them to gather for a meeting. What do they want?" The guard outside the door quickly replied, "Lord Imperial Tutor, they are indeed not here on orders, but they said that they have something important to discuss with you." The imperial tutor frowned and thought for a moment. He guessed the intentions of the 12 divine generals and divine kings, and could not help but feel displeased. These impatient fellows, how can they achieve great things if they are so impatient and rash after such a small setback? The imperial tutor cursed in his heart and he felt a little sad. In the past he had a few experts who were shrewd enough to accomplish great things and take charge of a region. But now those experts had been killed by Kenshin, so he had no one to use under his command. With a sorrowful heart, the imperial tutor got up and left the secret chamber, hurrying to the study. A moment later, when he entered the study, he saw the 12 divine generals waiting for him in the study. These god generals were all high-level god kings. Some were commanders of a region, while others were leaders of primordial clans or peak forces. Although each of them had different appearances, their auras were very majestic and their strength was not ordinary. Seeing the imperial tutor enter the study, everyone bowed in unison and said in unison, "Greetings, Imperial Tutor." The imperial tutor nodded slightly and walked to the throne expressionlessly. He calmly swept his gaze across the crowd and asked in a dignified tone, "What? After hearing some rumors and criticism outside, you can't keep your cool anymore?" The 12 god generals were stunned by the question. After looking at each other, someone immediately stepped forward and remonstrated. Lord Imperial Tutor, we have indeed heard some rumors and criticism. However, those rumors have been circulating for a month and everyone on the continent knows about it. Moreover, the criticism and slander among the people have caused great harm and humiliation to you. As the saying goes, if the master is humiliated, the servant will die. You are magnanimous and did not argue with the ants, but we cannot sit by and do nothing. Another immortal general also took a step forward, bowed and reported, Lord Imperial Preceptor, if it's just rumors and slander from the outside world, we can just ignore them. An eagle naturally won't care about the ridicule of an ant. However, the entire boundless heaven continent is filled with such rumors, and the direction of the wind and the situation are all controlled by Kenshin. Now our army's morale has been greatly affected, and the soldiers are all depressed and anxious. To tell you the truth, for the past month, the daily headcount has revealed that there are soldiers from various divisions who have fled. The third god general followed up and said, Lord Imperial Tutor, 1,000-mile dam can be destroyed by an ant's nest. You should know this better than us. If we don't think of a way to stabilize our army's morale, I'm afraid that before the 4 armies of Kenshin arrive, the soldiers will collapse without a fight. After all, those ordinary soldiers are definitely not as calm and confident as you. Following that, a few more god generals also spoke up to persuade the Imperial Tutor that it was time to take action and express his opinion. However, the Imperial Tutor listened quietly and did not express his opinion. After everyone had said what they needed to say and the study fell into silence, he slowly opened his mouth and said, Are you done saying what you want to say? Is there anyone else who wants to add? The god generals looked at each other and did not say anything. The Imperial Tutor's attitude made them feel uneasy. They were all worried that the goal of this trip would be difficult to achieve. As expected, the Imperial Tutor looked at them from the corner of his eyes and sipped his tea unhurriedly. He said, You guys have been rambling about so much. It sounds like you have a good reason and the situation is very tense. However, in reality, do you think that you can hide your thoughts from me? Isn't what you really want to know the reason why I'm so fearless? These few words poked at the god generals' thoughts and caused their expressions to change slightly. However, 2 of the god generals reacted quickly and hurriedly bowed and explained. Lord Imperial Preceptor is indeed wise and mighty, unparalleled in the world. Nothing can escape your eyes. However, we all know and believe that you have enough confidence and means to annihilate the Kenshin. However, the tens of thousands of soldiers under your command are stupid and do not know this. Lord, of course we believe in you. Including the 300 generals and god kings, we also have great confidence in you. However, no matter how hard we tried, we could not pacify the soldiers under your command. If we can't pacify the soldiers, they will not stop running away. Simply put, these god generals had their thoughts exposed by the Imperial Tutor and openly admitted it. They then shifted the blame to the soldiers and cleared themselves of all responsibility. The Imperial Tutor did not bother to expose them or reprimand them. He looked up and scanned the crowd. He saw that all the god generals were looking at him with burning eyes and full of anticipation. He knew that these god generals would not give up until they achieved their goal. Moreover, as the commander-in-chief, he had to consider the big picture. After hiding it for so long, it was time to let the generals know something to calm them down. Thus, the corners of the Imperial Preceptor's mouth curled up into a playful smile. He stroked his beard and asked everyone, Right now the sword god is in the limelight. His reputation is monstrous. The outside world is spreading rumors about how he is full of schemes, how powerful he is, and how he is unrivaled in the world. However, in reality, is he really invincible? Is his scheme really unbreakable and impossible to guard against? No. Let me tell you, in front of absolute power, his strength and schemes will become the biggest joke. Chapter 4159. In the end, the Imperial Tutor still did not clearly state what the trump card he was relying on for his confidence was. However, the 12 divine generals were not fools. From the Imperial Tutor's words, they had also caught some clues and vaguely guessed the answer. Kenshin was powerful enough and his schemes and shrewdness were also deep enough. However, the Imperial Tutor said that in the face of absolute power, Kenshin was a joke. Then who could compare to Kenshin in terms of absolute power? The answer was obvious. Thus, after the 12 divine generals guessed the answer, they all felt relieved. After chatting with the Imperial Tutor and discussing some minor matters, they all bowed and bade farewell, turning to leave the study. Of course, before the 12 divine generals left, the imperial tutor solemnly warned them. No matter what, they could not reveal this secret. The 12 divine generals naturally obeyed and expressed that they would not leak this secret. A few days later, the 12 divine generals commanded more than 300 generals to suppress and restrain the tens of thousands of soldiers under their command. After the strict military orders were passed down, the soldiers' discussions clearly decreased. Most of the negative, neglectful, and pessimistic emotions were also eliminated, and their morale had also clearly increased. Of course, these changes were all achieved under the 12 divine generals' unyielding orders. The answer they had guessed was not revealed to anyone. Even the 300 divine kings and generals did not know, let alone the tens of thousands of soldiers. As a result, there were still a small number of soldiers who were pessimistic and worried about the future. They did not believe that the imperial tutor had any hope of defeating Xianxia. Every day, some soldiers would still quietly escape, but the number was much lower than before. Every day, there were still soldiers discussing the situation in private and spreading the news of the rebel alliance's triumphant advance. However, the soldiers all suppressed it and did not dare to spread it widely, only discussing it in private. The 4 armies of the rebel alliance were as aggressive as ever, flattening everything in their path. The imperial tutor did not clearly state his position and was clearly in a passive state, with almost no one he could use. The entire boundless heaven continent's forces and powerhouses all saw it clearly. Everyone believed that the imperial tutor was determined to defend the Dark Knight domain and fight a final battle with the rebel alliance. In that case, before the final battle, the imperial tutor faction would not be able to fight back. Since that was the case, there was no need for the domain lords to resist. Everyone had the same mentality. Since the rebel alliance's army had arrived, they would first surrender to the rebel alliance and pledge their allegiance to the Xianxia. In any case, the imperial tutor doesn't care if we live or die, so there's no need to talk about loyalty. In the end, when the imperial tutor fought the rebel alliance, we would stand by and not interfere. If the rebel alliance wins, we will be safe. If the rebel alliance is defeated and the imperial tutor wins, we can say that we were forced into a corner. In short, these domain lords did not feel guilty. They were just waiting to see the results of the final battle. The 4 armies of the rebel alliance did not disappoint the people of the boundless heaven continent. In the next 4 months, almost every 2 or 3 days, there would be news of victory from one of the armies, announcing that a certain domain had been subdued. Of course, there were only about 40 domains left that had not yet surrendered to the rebel alliance. Among them, there were more than 20 domain lords who were loyal to the imperial tutor and the Azure God Emperor. As early as a few months ago, when the imperial tutor ordered them to gather at the Dark Knight domain, they had already been ordered to rush to the Dark Knight domain. Their respective domains were in a state of emptiness and no one was defending them. Whichever army of the rebel alliance arrived, it was directly subdued. In fact, many forces that took advantage of the situation emerged in the domains abandoned by the domain lords. Every domain had a few top or first-tier forces, or clans and sects with a strong foundation. When the domain lords were in power, they could only obediently lay low due to the rule of the domain lords, the imperial tutor and the Azure God Emperor. But in this turmoil they saw an opportunity to rise. When they learned that the rebel alliance's army was about to arrive, the first-tier forces, clans and sects of these domains actually expressed their welcome and surrender to the rebel alliance in advance. They were very willing to join the rebel alliance and swear to the rebel alliance that they were loyal to the Xianxia. The reason why they did this was very simple. It was to gain the recognition of the rebel alliance and the Xianxia and choose them as the new domain lords. After all, the rebel alliance had always done this. If any domain's domain lord fled or if the domain lord resisted stubbornly and was killed, the rebel alliance would elect a new domain lord after subduing the domain. The newly elected domain lord did not need to be very strong, nor did they need to be very scheming and shrewd. The most important thing was that they had to be obedient and absolutely loyal to the rebel alliance and the Xianxia. This was not a difficult task for many forces, clans and sections. And reality proved that the rebel alliance was very pleased with these smart and obedient forces. In the beginning, the first-tier forces of each domain who were the first to surrender and swear loyalty to the rebel alliance would be recognized and appointed as the new domain lords by the rebel alliance. Later on, when the news spread, it caused many regions to follow suit. In those domains that were abandoned by the domain lords and had no power, 3 or 4 forces actually appeared and surrendered to the rebel alliance at the same time and declared their loyalty. This made people not know whether to laugh or cry. The rebel alliance's army could not refuse the allegiance of several forces, so they could only choose the most suitable one to be the new domain lord. Later on, something even more laughable happened. The domain lord of a certain domain was still there, but several forces of that domain secretly contacted the rebel alliance's army and surrendered to the rebel alliance. Their attitudes were very sincere and they swore to join the rebel alliance. They looked like they wanted the rebel alliance to immediately take out the oath of surrender. They did not hesitate and immediately read it out. This made the rebel alliance feel a little awkward, so they could only tactfully refuse their allegiance. But they insisted that the domain lord of that domain was hesitant and not decisive enough. It was obvious that he was not loyal to the Kenshin. But they were absolutely loyal to the Kenshin and would not have any doubts or reservations. If they were appointed as domain lords, they would do their best and carry out every order of the Kenshin. This series of actions made the rebel alliance's people dumbfounded. They could not help but exclaim that these people were really shameless. In order to fight for the position of domain lord, they did not even care about integrity. After the matter, the domain lord of that domain naturally surrendered to the rebel alliance. But after the news of several forces surrendering secretly spread, the domain lord was also very embarrassed and criticized. Thus, in order to restore his reputation, the domain lord could only restore the freedom of the people as quickly as possible. Moreover, he earnestly carried out the rebel alliance's orders and became more diligent in caring for the people. Chapter 4160. Unknowingly, 4 lively and noisy months had passed. In these 4 months, the rebel alliance was the well-deserved protagonist, leading the tide and dominating the boundless heaven continent. It was the main topic of discussion among millions of people every day. The people of the entire boundless heaven continent were praising the merits of the rebel alliance, and the courage and love of the cowardly Kenshin. After the people of the various regions that had long been ruled by the rebel alliance regained their freedom, not only did they take the initiative to destroy the statues of the Shura god emperor and the region lord, they also spontaneously built countless shrines to worship the sword god and created many exquisite statues of the sword god. Logically speaking, they had been oppressed for 1,000 years and had to work as coolies to plunder cultivation resources. They were forced to believe in the Shura god emperor and provide the power of pious faith. Now that they had finally regained their freedom, they hated worshipping statues, and even more hated worshipping and praying on time. However, the people worshipped and were grateful to Kenshin from the bottom of their hearts. The construction of the temples and statues was voluntary. Even the large-scale worship and blessing ceremonies were organized by the people spontaneously. They held all kinds of ceremonies mainly to thank Kenshin for saving them, and also to pray for Kenshin, hoping that Kenshin would live as long as the heavens and never be obliterated. Only in this way could Kenshin protect the people forever. Since ancient times, the people were the simplest, most honest and kindest. They might not understand any great principles, nor did they understand what the big picture was. They only knew that whoever oppressed, squeezed and enslaved them was their enemy. Whoever sympathized, pitied and saved them was their benefactor. If this benefactor was only good to them, took them to heart and did not ask for anything from them, then this person was a great saint, a savior. There was no doubt that Ji Tianqing was such an existence in the eyes of the people. After 4 months, the rebel alliance's results were remarkable. 42 more regions successively returned to the rebel alliance and pledged loyalty to Kenshin. At this point, 95% of the entire boundless heaven continent's territories were all under Ji Tianqing's command. He already became the master of the boundless heaven continent in name and in reality. However, the Dark Night domain and the 2 surrounding domains had yet to be conquered, so the war was not over yet. That night, the 4 armies of the rebel alliance merged and became 2 armies. The army led by Ji Tianqing from the north met up with the army led by Patriarch Wanyan from the west. The southern army led by Nangong Buhua met up with the eastern army led by Duguzhan. One of the 2 armies was stationed at the border of the overlooking wind region, while the other was stationed at the border of the origin heaven region. The overlooking wind region and the Yuantian region were respectively on the left and right of the Dark Night region, like 2 most loyal guards, firmly protecting the Dark Night region. Even if the entire boundless heaven continent surrendered, these two regions' domain lords still resisted stubbornly to the end. At the border of the Linfeng domain, after the northern and western armies met up, Ji Tianqing personally led them. This army of more than 6,000 people was galloping through the night towards the central region of the Linfeng domain. With the experience and lessons of the past few months, even if the rebel alliance controlled the overall situation and victory was in sight, the soldiers did not dare to be complacent and did not lower their guard. The army's morale was still high, and they carried out their orders meticulously. On the god-slaying battleship in Ji Tianqing's private room, he was sitting cross-legged on a prayer mat made of divine jade, quietly meditating and adjusting his breathing. But for some reason he couldn't calm down tonight and felt a little restless. For an expert like him, such a situation rarely occurred. The previous 2 times it had occurred, it meant that his sixth sense had burst forth, and the heavens had given him some warning and premonition. Therefore, Ji Tianqing did not suspect anything and immediately realized that some kind of danger was about to appear. He thought to himself, "It has been exactly a year since the alliance was established. I have now conquered 97 domains and only 3 are left. If I can successfully conquer these 3 domains and defeat the imperial tutor, it will be at least a year earlier than I originally expected." However, the imperial tutor has been too low-key in the past few months. If he didn't have any trump cards to rely on, he definitely wouldn't have waited for death in the face of the rebel alliance's aggression. Even if the experts under his command fell one after another, he would have thought of other ways to stall for time and weaken the rebel alliance's strength. But he didn't do anything. He just defended his base in the Dark Knight domain and watched as I killed my way to him. No one would believe that he didn't have any schemes or trump cards to rely on. Ji Tianqing thought to himself, apart from the Azura God Emperor, what other trump cards could the imperial tutor rely on? But the Azura God Emperor had clearly indicated that the mission of solving the mystery of the grey fog in the depths of the void was more important. He had no time to care about the lives of the imperial tutor and the others. Could it be that the Azura God Emperor will send an avatar back to support him? If that's the case, it's a normal reaction. No wonder the imperial tutor has such confidence and a trump card. However, when Ji Tianqing thought about it, he still felt that something was amiss. But even if the Azura God Emperor's avatar came back to support him, he wouldn't have enough confidence to defeat me and destroy the rebel alliance, right? The Azura God Emperor and the imperial tutor should know that I defeated several avatars of the God Emperor a few years ago. Even if the Azura God Emperor's avatar came, he wouldn't be able to defeat me. After careful consideration, a thought flashed through Ji Tianqing's mind. But he felt that this conjecture was too absurd. It shouldn't be possible, so he ruled it out. At this moment, the Wanyan clan leader's voice came from outside the secret room. Reporting to Lord Alliance Leader, we just received a message from Shemi Paradise, reporting the latest news. All the clan leaders have gathered in the conference room and are waiting for you to discuss the matter. Ji Tianqing acknowledged and let the Wanyan clan leader leave first. Then he finished his meditation and left the secret room for the conference room. The clan leaders and sect leaders of the various forces were all present and were waiting respectfully. When they saw Ji Tianqing arrive, everyone greeted him in unison. After Ji Tianqing sat down at the head of the table, everyone sat down one after another. The Wanyan clan leader stood up, holding the message from Shemi Paradise in his hand, and announced the news to everyone. Cave Master Shemi's report was very detailed. Moreover, Shemi Paradise was the best at gathering information, so this news was also very reliable. The Cave Master's message was detailed and precise, which could also be understood as a rigorous and long report. The main meaning was that the 30,000 main forces under the Imperial Tutor were lying in ambush in the Dark Knight region. In addition, as the last 2 barriers to the Dark Knight region, the Overlooking Wind region and the Origin Heaven region also had a large number of troops lying in ambush. Among them, there were about 12,000 people lying in ambush in the Overlooking Wind region, and nearly 10,000 people in the Dark Knight region. These were the elites that the Imperial Tutor had transferred from the various regions. Most of them were divine lords, and there were dozens of divine kings overseeing the 2 regions. Chapter 4161. Ji Tianqing had long known that the Imperial Tutor had gathered nearly 500 god kings over the past year. Excluding the 100 or so god kings killed by the Rebel Alliance, there were still more than 360 god kings alive. Since there were more than 360 god kings, it was normal for the imperial tutor to transfer 100 god kings to guard the Linfeng domain and the Yuantian domain. If it had been half a month ago when the four armies of the rebel alliance had not converged, it would have been very difficult to conquer the Linfeng domain and the Yuantian domain. At the very least, except for the northern army led by Zhi Tianxing, it was impossible for the other three armies to defeat the enemy army of more than 10,000. Because of this, Zhi Tianxing had already formulated a strategy to conquer all the regions around the boundless heaven continent first, and then approach the Anya domain. This method of extracting silk from a cocoon could slowly erode the territory and weaken the power of the imperial tutor. In the end, the imperial tutor would only be left with the Anya domain, the Linfeng domain and the Yuantian domain. Tonight, the patriarchs and sect masters came to the meeting to listen to Zhi Tianxing's advice and guidance so that they could prepare and respond when they arrived at the domain master's manor tomorrow. After listening to Patriarch Wanyan's report, Zhi Tianxing said calmly, "The Linfeng domain and the Yuantian domain only have more people guarding them, but there are no experts that are too difficult to deal with. The elite forces under the imperial tutor are concentrated in the Anya domain. Although the Linfeng domain and the Yuantian domain are fortresses and barriers for the Anya domain. But the imperial tutor does not have the courage to transfer more troops to support them, and it is impossible for him to personally take action. Therefore, although there will be a certain amount of danger and casualties when we attack the Linfeng domain and the Yuantian domain tomorrow, it will not be a big problem. You don't have to worry too much." Since Zhi Tianxing said so, the patriarchs and sect masters were relieved and obviously much more relaxed. Then Zhi Tianxing deduced several possible situations and taught them how to deal with them. Everyone listened carefully and memorized it in their hearts. After a quarter of an hour, the short meeting ended. Everyone left the conference room one after another. Zhi Tianxing also returned to the secret chamber to continue meditating. Clan leader Wanyan was in charge of recording the contents of the meeting just now. He mainly recorded what Zhi Tianxing said and sent it to Nangong Buhua through a communication jade slip. With that, the army led by Nangong Buhua felt much more confident. They were filled with confidence and anticipation for the invasion of the Origin Heaven domain tomorrow. Time passed quickly. 20 hours later, the evening of the second day arrived. The fleet led by the god-slaying battleship flew across the sky and arrived at the domain chief's manor in the Linfeng domain. The domain chief's manor was located in a secret realm. The secret realm had a circumference of a few 100,000 miles. It was filled with abundant divine energy and resources. It could be said to be one of the best among the hundreds of secret realms, and it was only inferior to the blessed paradises. In addition, the downwind region was rich in resources, and the region master was the imperial tutor's most trusted aide. Therefore, the downwind region had always been very rich and affluent. The number of Divine Lord experts and Divine King powerhouses was much more than other regions. The downwind region master hadn't left the domain chief's manor and gone to the Anya domain to avoid the disaster. As early as half a month ago, he had expressed his attitude to the imperial tutor and vowed to live and die with the soldiers of the downwind region. Even if he died on the battlefield, he wouldn't abandon the domain chief's manor, let alone surrender to the rebel alliance. His loyalty naturally made the imperial tutor feel very gratified and touched. Therefore, the imperial tutor sent a team of personal guards to bring the downwind region master's family and relatives to the Azura Divine Palace in the Anya domain. The imperial tutor wanted to express that he would do his best to protect the downwind region master's family and not distract him so that he could fight with all his strength. Another meaning was that even if the downwind region master died on the battlefield, the imperial tutor would take good care of his family. Of course, this was good and the downwind region master was grateful. But like everyone else, he couldn't help but think that the imperial tutor had a third intention. That was to use the downwind region master's family as a shackle to force the downwind region master to fight and be loyal to his duty. To put it nicely, this was called encouragement, but to put it bluntly, it was a threat. The downwind region master understood it, but he didn't point it out. Instead, he was very grateful to the imperial tutor. Ever since his family was taken away, he had devoted himself to setting up defenses and preparing for the battle in the past half a month. Under his arrangement and command, 12,000 soldiers protected the inside and outside of the domain chief's manor. In addition to so many soldiers, he also led the soldiers to set up layers of defensive formations. In order not to affect the final battle, He also transferred all the servants of the domain chief's manor to other places. Now there were 4,000 soldiers outside the secret realm and 8,000 soldiers inside the secret realm. Apart from these 12,000 soldiers, there was not a single person who was not related to them. The downwind region master also wore armor all day and had a sword at his waist. He looked like he was ready to fight at any time and would never return. When the sun was setting, Zhi Tianxing's god-slaying battleship arrived outside the domain chief's manor with several other battleships. A few hundred miles ahead, there was a giant mountain that was tens of thousands of feet high. The peak of the mountain was shrouded in a sea of clouds. In the sea of clouds, there was a square with a radius of 100 miles. A huge altar stood in the middle of the square. That was the entrance to the secret realm. A total of 4,000 soldiers in armor and holding swords were firmly guarding the square and the altar at the peak of the mountain. Among them, 2,000 soldiers stood in the open. Their bodies were like javelins and stone statues. The other 2,000 soldiers hid in the dark, ready to provide support at any time. The soldiers of the downwind region all knew that the army that was about to attack the domain chief's manor was personally led by Kenshin. Although everyone believed that Kenshin would take care of his reputation and attack openly instead of sneak attacks, the downwind region master was very cautious. However, the overlord of 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 the overlord region was extremely cautious. However, it turned out that he was overthinking. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. Just as everyone had guessed, the fleet led by the sword god openly appeared in the sea of clouds and stopped 100 miles away from the entrance of the secret realm. The god-slaying battleship was at the forefront, piloted by Bai Long. It opened its wings, revealing 600 flashing muzzles that were aimed at the square at the peak of the mountain. Zhi Tianxing walked out of the battleship and stood high in the sky, looking down at the peak of the mountain and the entrance of the secret realm. Behind the god-slaying battleship, the 8 forces battleships were arranged in a wing shape, ready to attack. As soon as the two sides met, they were ready to fight. The atmosphere between heaven and earth seemed to have frozen, filled with murderous intent. Even though the soldiers of the Linfeng domain had expected this day to come and were mentally prepared for it, the Linfeng domain soldiers were still shocked. However, when they saw Kenshin appear with their own eyes, they couldn't help but feel terrified. They had no choice. Kenshin was too famous and his power was too terrifying. In the past 4 months, Zhi Tianxing often cultivated in the distorted time and space of the divine tower in seclusion. Not only did he refine all the divine spark fragments he had, but he also cultivated in seclusion for 10 years. Therefore his strength had doubled and his aura was even more unfathomable, like the power of heaven. Chapter 4162. On the plaza at the peak of the mountain, there were 2,000 guards on the surface, and another 2,000 guards were hidden in the dark. At this moment, everyone's attention was on Zhi Tianxing. Everyone wanted to know what Kenshin was going to say and do. There were even a few guards who fantasized about how great it would be if Kenshin could sit down and negotiate with the territorial lord. Then the two sides would not have to fight, and they would not become dead souls under Kenshin's sword. Although everyone knew that this was an extravagant hope, the two sides were like fire and water and there would be a battle. However, under Kenshin's prestige and the threat of death, they still could not help but feel that they were lucky. At this moment, Zhi Tianxing looked down at the many guards with an indifferent expression and said in a cold tone, "Although it's useless for me to persuade you to surrender now, I still want to say it clearly. The Rebel Alliance is only fighting to save the people of the world and return peace and tranquility to the world, not to kill. As long as you immediately lay down your arms and surrender, I can spare your lives and let you go." Zhi Tianxing's words were not only the original intention of the Rebel Alliance's establishment, but also the principle that the Rebel Alliance had always practiced. His original purpose was not to occupy the boundless heaven continent, to sit on hundreds of millions of people and endless resources, and to enjoy the glory and power of the position of overlord of the continent. He only wanted to destroy the foundation of the Azura God Emperor's power and save the hundreds of millions of people of the boundless heaven continent. Therefore, the Rebel Alliance occupied more than 90 regions in a short year, but did not waste time to consolidate control of each region, and did not plunder resources and wealth. It was also because of this that the people of the boundless heaven continent saw all of this with their own eyes, so they supported the Rebel Alliance so much and worshipped Zhi Tianxing so much. The 4,000 guards on the mountain peak had a somewhat complicated look in their eyes when they heard Ji Tianxing's words. Many guards approved of Ji Tianxing and the rebel alliance from the bottom of their hearts, and also believed his words. If they had a choice, of course they would want to lay down their arms and surrender and not die in vain. However, their status and situation had determined that they could only fight to the death here today. They could not surrender or run away. After a brief moment of silence, a guard commander flew out from the crowd and cupped his fists to Ji Tianxing. With a solemn expression he said, "Although we are enemies and not friends, Kenshin's conduct is well known by the world. We naturally admire you and would like to thank Kenshin for giving us this opportunity. However, we have military orders and do not dare to disobey. We can only swear to uphold them to the death. Kenshin, sorry for the offense." After saying that, the guard commander drew his sword, raised his arm and shouted, "Protect our homeland, we will not retreat even if we die." The 2,000 guards in the square also waved their swords and shouted. For a moment the guards were in high spirits. Their morale had also increased by a lot. They were no longer as dispirited as before. Ji Tianxing didn't waste any time and immediately gave the order to attack. Thus, the god-slaying battleship and the 8 battleships on both sides launched the first round of attacks. Boom, 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 boom. The 9 battleships activated their arrays at almost the same time, releasing more than 5,000 dazzling pillars of light. Like a rain of swords, they cut through the night sky and blasted toward the square on the summit. At that moment, thousands of dazzling pillars of divine power lit up the night sky for tens of thousands of miles. The dense rain-like pillars of light carried with them a destructive power that tore apart the barrier between the night sky and space, creating dense spatial cracks in the night sky. Naturally, the mountain peak with a radius of 100 miles also suffered a devastating blow. Although the 2,000 guards guarding the mountain peak had activated their defensive array in time, forming a huge defensive light shield. But when thousands of pillars of light blasted down, the defensive light shield didn't even last for a moment before shattering. Immediately after, the mountain peak was drowned in dazzling divine light and turned into endless ashes and dust on the spot, stirring up billowing smoke and dust. The entire mountain was destroyed and disappeared, leaving behind only a huge crater and ruins. When the pillars of divine power descended, the 2,000 guards didn't dare to escape due to military orders. They even joined forces to cast spells to resist. Unfortunately, their strength was too weak. Trying to resist the attack of the god-slaying battleship, a supreme-grade king-level divine artifact, was like a mantis trying to stop a chariot. When the billowing smoke and dust dissipated, the earth-shattering explosions gradually stopped. At that moment, the 2,000 guards on the mountain peak also disappeared along with the mountain peak. They didn't even have time to fight back. Under the simultaneous attack of the 9 battleships, they were turned into ashes and dust. Such terrifying power made the 2,000 guards hiding in the dark tremble with fear. They only wanted to turn around and run. Originally, they were hiding in the dark and wanted to use the power of the array to launch a sneak attack while the 2 sides were fighting. But they never expected that the battle between the 2,000 guards and the Rebel Alliance would end as soon as it started. The 2,000 guards on the square didn't even have a chance to fight back before they were blasted to pieces. How terrifying was that? At that moment, the 2,000 guards hiding in the dark finally understood the terrifying power and methods of the Kenshin. They also finally understood why the territorial lords of the more than 90 domains surrendered at the sight of the battle. They seemed to have no backbone and dignity. If they were in the same situation, they wouldn't care about dignity under the threat of death. Fortunately, the place where they were hiding was quite far from the square on the mountain peak. It was at least 10,000 miles away. Even if the mountain peak was destroyed and they were affected, they only suffered some injuries. They weren't killed. If they were closer, they would probably have been turned into ashes. Retreat. The guard commander ordered. He immediately led the 2,000 guards to retreat into the distance and escape from the battlefield. They had been hiding in the dark and hadn't shown their faces. Even if they turned around and fled now, they would do it secretly. It should be safer. At the entrance of the secret realm above the ruins, clan leader Wang Yan and the others looked at Ji Tianxing and asked, "Alliance leader, those 2,000 people hiding in the dark, should we, Alliance leader, please allow us to chase after them? I guarantee that we will finish them in an hour." "Alliance leader, please allow us to go." The military strength of our 3 clans is enough to finish the battle in 15 minutes. Clearly, those 2,000 guards thought that they were hiding, but they had been discovered by Ji Tianxing and the others long ago. However, Ji Tianxing couldn't be bothered with them. Hearing the clan leader's request, Ji Tianxing waved his hand and replied, "They are just soldiers who were forced by military orders. Since they retreated voluntarily, there is no need to make things difficult for them. The most important thing now is to enter the secret realm and finish off the overlooking wind zone lord." The clan leaders didn't have any objections. They all acknowledged the order. Next, everyone started to break the array at the entrance of the secret realm. The array was originally on the mountain peak. After the mountain peak was destroyed, the array altar was also destroyed. The Great Formation was also blasted apart. The invisible formation light wall was exposed and revealed in the sky. It was covered in cracks. Clan leader Wang Yan and the others went up. They couldn't be bothered to break the array. The clan leaders joined forces with a dozen divine kings to attack together and break the array with brute force. Chapter 4163. Boom. Crack. With a deafening cracking sound, the array in the sky was broken and a huge hole appeared. Ji Tianxing stepped through the hole and entered the secret realm of the Windfall Territorial Lord. The god-slaying battleship followed closely behind, and the other 8 forces battleships also entered one after another. The secret realm was spacious and the scenery was picturesque. However, it was quiet all around and the air was filled with tension and depression. Half a month ago, the Windfall Territorial Lord had evacuated all unrelated personnel, leaving only 8,000 soldiers to guard the secret realm. At this moment, the secret realm looked peaceful, but danger lurked in every corner. There were arrays and traps everywhere. In the sky, Ji Tianxing stood on the top of the god-slaying battleship with his hands behind his back, looking ahead calmly. The white dragon steered the god-slaying battleship forward at a steady pace. The 8 divine battleships followed behind, arranged in a sharp knife formation, showing a domineering posture that could penetrate everything. When the fleet had just advanced 10,000 miles, Ji Tianxing frowned. A divine light flashed in his right hand and he took out the divine hammer. He looked at the empty sky in front of him and waved the divine hammer in his right hand, smashing out 2 beams of dazzling divine light. Swoosh, swoosh. The 2 beams of divine light carried endless power and smashed into the sky 1,000 miles away, causing 2 earth-shattering explosions. Bang, bang. In the seemingly empty sky, a canopy actually appeared and was smashed to pieces on the spot. Obviously, it was a trap array set up by the Windfall Territorial Lord. It had been invisible before it was activated. However, this hidden array could not escape Ji Tianxing's eyes. He had seen through it a long time ago. The array was broken and the fleet was not affected at all. They continued to advance. Next, the fleet had to advance 10,000 miles to reach the Territorial Lord's mansion. During this process, Ji Tianxing would find 7 trap arrays, killing arrays and maze arrays as well as 6 traps. The Windfall Territorial Lord had spent a lot of effort, time, manpower and resources to set up those arrays and traps. However, Ji Tianxing could always see through them in advance and break them quickly with simple and violent means. The fleet had been advancing steadily without any obstruction. 100 breaths later, the fleet arrived outside the Domain Chief's manor. At this time, in the Domain Chief's manor surrounded by mountains, the Domain Chief had already received the news through the reports of the various surveillance formations and scouts. When he found out that the formations and traps he had set up with all his might had failed to cause any trouble to the fleet, he was shocked. Therefore, Kenshin was able to easily break through the array formations and traps. His expression immediately turned ugly and his eyes flashed with deep shock and awe. He couldn't help but sigh, as expected of the Kenshin. I spent nearly a month of effort, but I couldn't even stop him for a moment. Other than the Imperial Tutor, who else is qualified to exchange blows with him? The Windfall District Lord's lips curled into a bitter smile. He had already predicted the outcome. But even so, there was no turning back. He could not back down, nor could he back down. After all, he was the #1 loyal subject of the Imperial Tutor. The imprint on him was too deep and could not be erased. Even if he wanted to surrender, Kenshin might not accept it. Moreover, his family had been taken away by the Imperial Tutor to the Dark Knight domain. If he surrendered now, he was afraid that his family would not have a good ending. Let's go. Let's see the glory of the peerless Kenshin with our own eyes. The Windfall District Lord collected his chaotic thoughts. He stood up and straightened his cloak. Then he led the generals out of the study. Outside the domain chief's manor, 8,000 elite soldiers were divided into 2 circles to protect the domain chief's manor. The defensive formation within a radius of 10,000 miles was also activated. There were a total of 3 layers, protecting dozens of mountains within it. The soldiers were all equipped with armor and swords. They were ready to attack. Their murderous aura surged as they looked sternly at the 9 warships in the sky outside the formation. The 9 warships were still in the knife-edge formation. The thousands of soldiers had yet to show themselves. Only Ji Tianqing stood at the top of the Godslayer warship and looked at the domain chief's manor indifferently. He could see through the 3 layers of defensive formations at a glance. They were all king-grade divine formations. Their power was interconnected and their power was superimposed. For an ordinary god king, the 3 layers of defensive formations were difficult to deal with. They could not be broken in a short time. However, Ji Tianqing did not take them seriously. With the Godslayer warship and his divine hammer, he could quickly break through them. He waited patiently and did not rush to attack because the uneasiness in his heart had not disappeared. He was very confident that there were only 8,000 soldiers and the Windfall District Lord in the domain chief's manor. However, he still wanted to see if there were any other ambushers besides the 8,000 soldiers. Or perhaps, the Imperial Tutor had made arrangements and plans to ambush some experts here? If the 2 sides were to fight, and the Azura God Emperor's avatar suddenly appeared, that would be the most surprising and exciting thing for him. Although it sounded ridiculous, he did not rule out this possibility. Because he believed in the warning given by the heavens. Soon, the Windfall District Lord, escorted by a dozen divine generals, flew to the sky above the domain chief's manor. They were thousands of miles away from Ji Tianqing. They faced each other across the defensive formation. Greetings, Kenshin. As soon as the 2 sides met, the Windfall District Lord and a dozen divine generals cupped their fists and bowed to Ji Tianqing. Both their tone and posture were respectful. They were sincere and not pretentious. Although the 2 sides were enemies, there was no deep hatred between them. Even if they had to fight with their weapons and fight with their lives, it was only because they were on different sides. This did not stop the Windfall District Lord and the others from showing respect to Kenshin from the bottom of their hearts. Not all enemies were bad people. It was even more impossible for them to be unreasonable and vicious people. Those who could become god kings and domain lords might be sinister and treacherous, or they might be scheming. However, none of them were fools. In fact, everyone in the boundless heaven continent knew whether Kenshin's actions were for his own benefit or for the sake of justice. Ji Tianqing nodded slightly in return and said, "Everyone, you're too courteous. The great battle is imminent. I have a few words to say. Although they may be nonsense, I still have to say them. After all, what I and the Rebel Alliance are doing is not for the sake of killing or power. It is only for freedom and peace. Everyone present, if you can stop now and surrender, you can also avoid the calamity of the weapons and make even more soldiers sacrifice their lives. I promise to spare one of you from death and not pursue the matter." In fact, both sides' attitudes were very clear. These words were just a formality. If there were really soldiers who surrendered, Ji Tianqing would certainly fulfill his promise. However, the result was as everyone expected. None of the generals stepped forward to admit defeat. The Windfall District Lord also cupped his fists and bowed. "Kenshin, as the saying goes, a loyal man should serve with his life. Life is small, but reputation is important. Although we are not strong enough to defeat you, we are not afraid to die on the battlefield in the name of loyalty and filial piety." The so-called loyalty was naturally loyal to the Imperial Tutor and the Azura God Emperor. As for filial piety, it was naturally to protect his family. If he died here, he would leave behind the name of a loyal subject. The Imperial Tutor would also take good care of his family. If he surrendered now, he could live, but he would have to bear a bad reputation and implicate his family. Chapter 4164. Since the Protectorate Lord had made his stance clear, there was nothing more for them to say. Ji Tianqing stopped persuading them to surrender. He raised his hand and gave the order to attack. The 9 divine warships led by the god-slaying battleships were ready to attack. They had activated the array and accumulated powerful energy. The 500 cannons on each warship were aimed at the defensive array of the Protectorate Lord's mansion. When Ji Tianqing gave the order to attack, the 9 divine warships released destructive energy. Boom, 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 boom. More than 3,000 cannons spewed out dazzling divine light. They turned into thousands of dazzling light pillars and blasted at the defensive array. The 50 God Kings and 8,000 soldiers under the Region Lord's command were prepared for battle long ago. When the 9 divine warships launched their attack, they joined forces to cast spells and injected endless divine power into the array to strengthen it. At the same time, hundreds of soldiers who specialized in operating the divine array also controlled the array to release thousands of Kenshin light blades toward the 9 divine warships. Bang 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 bang. Boom. Boom. In the next moment, the sky-covering divine power light pillars collided with all kinds of light blades. There was a deafening explosion in the sky and it spread for tens of thousands of miles. Many light beams and light blades collapsed in the collision, splashing fragments all over the sky. The explosive energy wrapped around the divine light fragments and formed a torrent that spread outward and swept everything away. In the blink of an eye, the divine power light blades that filled the sky were shattered. More than half of the 3,000 light pillars released by the 9 divine warships collapsed. The remaining 1,000 light pillars hit the defensive array. Bang bang bang. Another series of loud noises reverberated between heaven and earth. Domain Lord Lin Feng had thought that the 8,000 soldiers would be able to counter the 2,000 light pillars. The remaining 1,000 light pillars shouldn't be a threat to the defensive array. But he forgot that more than 300 of the light pillars were released by the god-slaying battleships. Boom. Crack. Therefore, amidst the crisp shattering sounds, hundreds of holes were blasted into the first layer of the defensive formation, and the cracks were densely packed. The defensive light shield was severely damaged. It flashed with divine light and shook violently. Although the light shield didn't shatter or collapse, it had lost its protective power and needed to be repaired. In the midst of the battle, the Headwind Region Lord and the others naturally did not have the opportunity to repair the formation. At this moment, Ji Tianqing waved his divine hammer again and struck out 2 beams of divine light, striking the holes and cracks in the formation. Crack. Along with the sound of an explosion, the first layer of the defensive light shield was shattered and dissipated into pieces. Seeing this, the hearts of the Linfeng district lord and the 8,000 soldiers skipped a beat, and they all looked anxious and worried. His opponent had only used a single round of attacks from the godly warship, yet they had managed to break through a layer of defensive light barrier so easily. It was obvious that the remaining 2 layers of defensive formations would not be able to hold on for much longer. The Overlord of 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 the Overlord. The 9 divine warships gathered their power again and released thousands of light pillars, launching a second powerful attack. Filled with anxiety, the Downwind Protectorate Lord personally controlled the second layer of the formation, raising its defensive power to the maximum. Ping ping ping. This time, the thousands of light pillars struck the defensive formation, causing an earth-shattering boom to erupt. The light barrier was also riddled with cracks. The 8,000 soldiers of the Linfeng district did not fight back. They supported the defensive formation with all their might, but they still couldn't block the attacks of the 9 divine warships. The king-level upper-class divine warships of the 8 forces were not so bad. Although they were powerful, they couldn't break the defensive light shield with one hit. The most powerful and lethal one was still Ji Tianqing's god-slaying warship. After cracks appeared in the defensive formation, Ji Tianqing waved his divine hammer and smashed out 4 beams of dazzling divine light. Boom! Another deafening explosion sounded, and the second layer of the defensive formation was also destroyed. The 8,000 soldiers of the Linfeng district panicked. Their hearts were burning with anxiety and worry. The Linfeng district lord also knew that it was useless to fight back, so he personally cast a spell and led the soldiers in a counterattack. Needless to say, the 8,000 soldiers activated their divine power with all their might and performed all kinds of secret techniques and trump cards. Boom. The light pillars released by the 9 divine warships collided with the divine light shadows in the sky, creating a deafening sound. This time, the 9 divine warships attacked 3 times in a row before the 3rd layer of the defensive formation was completely destroyed. Without the protection of the 3 layers of formations, the 8,000 soldiers of the District Lord's mansion were completely exposed to the fleet. Everyone knew that the moment of life and death had come. The 8,000 soldiers all looked solemn. They launched the final counterattack with solemn and resolute emotions. The Linfeng District Lord hurriedly ordered the soldiers to spread out and fight the 9 divine warships. If they stayed together, they would only become living targets for the fleet. This tactic worked. After the 8,000 soldiers spread out, the bombardment of the 9 divine warships did not cause too many casualties. Instead, after the soldiers spread out, they attacked with all their might, which put the 8 divine warships in danger. Therefore, Ji Tianqing also decisively ordered the soldiers to attack. Thousands of disciples of the 8 forces flew out of the divine warships. Under the leadership of the family leaders and elders, they started to fight the soldiers of the Linfeng district. Thus the true battle began. More than 10,000 divine emperors and nearly 100 divine kings fought fiercely on the battlefield within a radius of 50,000 miles. The sky darkened and the earth dimmed. Almost every moment soldiers from both sides were killed. Flesh and blood splattered everywhere. They let out painful and dying cries. The area was completely chaotic. Scenes of blood and fire intertwined were everywhere. Ji Tianqing did not stay idle. He led Yun Yao, Jiku and 10 other people into the battlefield. They each looked for a target to kill. Ji Tianqing's target was naturally the Linfeng District Lord and the divine generals beside him. Yun Yao, Jiku and the others were mainly responsible for killing the enemy's divine kings and protecting their own troops. This fierce battle lasted for a whole hour before it ended. The aftermath of the battle between the 2 sides blasted the area within a radius of 50,000 miles into ruins. Towering mountains and steep ridges, dense forests and vegetation, as well as the magnificent Linfeng District Lord's mansion, many palaces and courtyards, all turned into dust. After an hour, the battle finally ended. The loud noise that reverberated between heaven and earth slowly dissipated. The dust and rain of blood that blotted out the sky continued to fall. There was no suspense about the outcome of the battle. The Linfeng District Lord and his 8,000 soldiers had all died on the battlefield. They turned into dust and returned to heaven and earth. They had paid the price with their lives for loyalty and righteousness. Ji Tianqing's troops had also lost close to 1,000 people. But compared to the enemy's complete annihilation, this battle could be said to be a complete victory. After the battle, Ji Tianqing only collected the godhead fragments of the 50 divine kings. He handed over the task of cleaning the battlefield and collecting the spoils of war to his subordinates. 2 hours later, the news that the Linfeng District Lord had been defeated and the rebel alliance had captured the Linfeng District spread. 4 hours later, another army of the rebel alliance had also defeated the Yuantian District Lord and captured the Yuantian District. As a result, only the Anya District had not been captured by the rebel alliance on the entire Boundless Heaven continent. Chapter 4165. The army led by Nangong Buhua was responsible for attacking the Origin Heaven domain. Although that army didn't have Ji Tianqing overseeing it, there were more divine emperors than Nangong Buhua. However, the army was larger in number and there were more god kings among them. There were only about 10,000 soldiers guarding the Origin Heaven domain. Therefore, it wasn't difficult for the army led by Nangong Buhua to win. A few hours later, the night passed and a new day arrived. The news that the Overlooking Wind domain and the Origin Heaven domain had been captured by the Rebel Alliance, and that the 2 domain lords and 20,000 soldiers had all died in battle spread across the Boundless Heaven continent. When the billions of people heard the news, they celebrated with joy, feeling proud of the Rebel Alliance and the Kenshin. Everyone believed that in a few days, the Kenshin would capture the Anya domain and kill the Imperial Tutor, and the war that had lasted for a year would be over. The dark rule and oppression that had lasted for thousands of years on the Boundless Heaven continent had also come to an end. This was a world-shaking event that changed the era and the Overlord's position. It would definitely be recorded in history and praised by future generations for tens of thousands of years. The billions of people were honored to be able to witness the whole process with their own eyes. At the same time, when the news reached the Anya domain, the billions of people were excited and full of anticipation. Although the people of this domain were the most oppressed by the Azura Divine Palace, they feared and hated the Azura Divine Palace the most. At the beginning of the Rebel Alliance's uprising, they didn't have any hope. But as one domain after another was captured by the Kenshin, more and more people regained their freedom, and they also had hope and expectations. Now, the 99 domains of the entire Boundless Heaven continent had been occupied, and only the Anya domain had not been captured. Of course, the people were excited, expectant, and a little anxious. They even hoped that the two armies of the Rebel Alliance wouldn't rest, and that they would rush to the Anya domain and capture it as soon as possible. It would be best if they could capture the Anya domain in a day or two, save the billions of people, and announce that peace and freedom had been restored to the entire Boundless Heaven continent. On the other side, the 30,000 soldiers under the imperial tutor were all restless and worried when they heard the news. The army's morale, which had just stabilized some time ago, collapsed by more than half in a day. Everyone in the army was discussing this matter. Everyone was in low spirits and their hearts were burning with anxiety. After all, the Dark Night region was already surrounded on all sides. They were alone and without help. Even if they had 30,000 soldiers, they still had the numerical advantage against the 20,000 soldiers of the Rebel Alliance. However, they had already lost their momentum. Everyone felt that they would definitely lose this battle. Thus, many of the low-level soldiers gathered together to discuss whether or not they should escape. There was still a chance to escape before the two armies of the Rebel Alliance entered the Dark Night domain and completed the encirclement. Over 200 Divine King powerhouses and generals naturally took notice of such a great disturbance in the morale of the army. They were also very worried and anxious. They issued strict orders many times to not allow the soldiers to discuss the Rebel Alliance, but it was useless. On the contrary, the more they suppressed the soldiers, the more they wanted to escape. As a result, the helpless god kings and generals could only ask the 12 divine generals for a countermeasure. In their opinion, the 12 divine generals had met the imperial tutor and had a secret conversation with the imperial tutor. As for why the imperial tutor was so confident and calm, he must have told them the reason. The 200 divine kings and generals hoped that the 12 divine generals would also tell them so that they could be at ease. Not long after, the 200 divine kings and generals expressed their wishes to the 12 divine generals. Unfortunately, the 12 divine generals made it clear that the imperial tutor had strictly ordered them to keep it a secret and not reveal any information. However, they could guarantee that the reason why the imperial tutor was so confident and calm was absolutely reliable. The soldiers did not have to worry about the Rebel Alliance at all. No matter how powerful the Kenshin was, the Azura Divine Palace would be fine. Victory would belong to them. Just like that, the 200 divine kings and generals were dismissed. Although they were still confused and did not know the specific reason, they felt much more at ease. However, the awkward thing was that when faced with the countless soldiers under their command, they still had no way to explain it. They could only pat their chests and swear that the imperial tutor had already thought of a countermeasure and had made preparations. He was just waiting for the Rebel Alliance to come and throw away their lives. Everyone did not have to worry or doubt. The Azura Divine Palace would definitely stand tall and the Rebel Alliance would be destroyed in the end. These meaningless words had no effect on the soldiers. The soldiers, whose morale was at its lowest and whose hearts were heavy, would not believe these words. In fact, many people believed that the imperial tutor had not done anything in the past few months and was waiting for death to come. Now that the Rebel Alliance had already killed their way to their doorstep and the imperial tutor had not done anything, he must have been at his wits' end. Since that was the case, there was no need to wait any longer. It was better to run. Thus, on the second night after the Rebel Alliance conquered the Overwind and Origin Sky regions, more than 3,000 divine lords fled the Dark Night region. On the third night, several divine kings and more than 1,000 divine lords took the opportunity to escape. On the fourth night, there were still more than 1,000 people who planned to escape. However, the strict inspection of the generals did not give them the chance to escape. Even so, only 25,000 of the 30,000 soldiers of the Dark Night region remained. Compared to the 20,000 soldiers of the Rebel Alliance, they did not have much of an advantage. On the 5th day, the 1,000 or so soldiers who had failed to escape became restless again. Unfortunately, when the sun set, the Rebel Alliance's army finally arrived. The first to arrive outside the Azura Paradise was the fleet led by the god-slaying warship. The Azura Paradise was the lair of the Azura God Emperor. The famous Azura Divine Palace was inside. The paradise was 1,000,000 miles wide and was like a small world. It had a vast territory and rich resources. Normally, the Azura Divine Palace housed nearly 100,000 people. Most of them were servants and family members. There were only 10,000 guards and dozens of divine kings. However, at this moment 15,000 of the 25,000 soldiers under the command of the imperial tutor were inside the paradise. The other 10,000 soldiers were guarding outside the paradise. Some of the soldiers were guarding the paradise's entrance. Most of them were patrolling the surroundings and monitoring the movements. A few months ago, traps, ambushes, and all kinds of formations were set up around the paradise's entrance. Ji Tianxing rode the god-slaying warship and led the army toward the paradise's entrance. Along the way he found more than a dozen traps and formations. He either tried to avoid them or destroyed them by force. Since he used his arts to destroy the traps and formations, it would definitely cause a huge commotion. Therefore the fleet could not hide their tracks. When they were 50,000 miles away from the Azura Paradise's entrance, they were discovered by the patrolling guards. Chapter 4166. The soldiers of the Dark Knight domain had been waiting for several months. Now the Anti-Rebels Alliance, which was at the height of its power, had finally arrived at the Azura Mystic Realm. The moment the fleet appeared, the patrolling guards were stunned for a moment before they came to their senses. They quickly alerted the generals guarding the entrance and reported the news to the divine generals guarding the Azura Paradise. After doing all this, everyone actually felt a sense of relief, as if a heavy burden had been lifted off their shoulders. That feeling was like a person who had a terminal illness and knew that there was no cure and that he would die without a doubt. However, he spent day after day in torment and waited for several months without dying. During this process he endured tremendous pressure and mental torture. Finally one day death came. Naturally, he would have the feeling that, it's finally here, I'm finally free. The patrolling guards and the soldiers guarding the entrance of the Azura Paradise all had the same thought. Even though they knew that they would most likely be killed in the final battle with the Kenshin and the Rebel Alliance. However, they would rather have a quick result than wait in torment. Fortunately, the Rebel Alliance represented an upright and mighty army. At this moment the final battle was imminent and they would not launch a sneak attack. The god-slaying battleship led the fleet and flew through the sky at a moderate speed. They crushed and flattened several arrays and stopped 2,000 miles away from the Azura Paradise's entrance. This gave the patrolling guards and the soldiers guarding the Azura Paradise's entrance time to react and prepare. Soon, the news reached the Azura Divine Palace and was known by the imperial tutor and many generals. The sound of a horn immediately sounded in the Divine Palace, waking everyone up. Their families, relatives, and servants all retreated to the depths of the Divine Palace and patiently waited for the result of the battle. The imperial tutor also put on a luxurious divine robe and a divine crown. Surrounded by a group of divine generals, he rushed to the Azura Paradise's entrance in a grandiose manner. Today's battle was inevitable. It was also the final battle between the two sides. The imperial tutor had been biding his time and keeping a low profile for several months. He was waiting for this day to wash away his shame and feel proud. He wanted to make a comeback and let the Kenshin and the Rebel Alliance feel what a shocking reversal and despair was. He also wanted the people of the boundless heaven continent to see that this continent ultimately belonged to the Azura God Emperor. No one could shake or snatch it away. Not even the legendary Kenshin could do it. Therefore, the imperial tutor dressed up and set off with steady steps and a dignified posture. Not long after, he appeared at the Azura Paradise's entrance with thousands of soldiers. The entrance was in the vast sea of clouds. There was a cloud platform with a radius of 100 miles. 5,000 soldiers in armor and swords stood on top of it. In the sky around the cloud platform, there were another 5,000 soldiers who had already arranged themselves in a defensive formation, confronting the fleet of the Anti-Rebel Alliance. Azura Paradise's Azura Paradise's Azura Paradise's Azura Paradise as Paradise's Azura Paradise. The imperial preceptor nodded gracefully and reservedly, indicating for the soldiers to dispense with the formalities. He then turned his gaze to the fleet 2,000 miles away and stared at the god-slaying battleship in the lead. 9 god-slaying battleships floated quietly in the sky. The attack formation had been activated and was silently accumulating power. The cannons were all pointed at the Azura Paradise's entrance. However, no one showed up, including Kenshin. The imperial tutor furrowed his white brows. The 2 strands of white hair at his temples danced in the wind. He said in a low and dignified tone, "Kenshin, how have you been? I've been waiting for today's battle for almost a year. You're finally here. Why are you still hiding and not willing to show up?" During the Great War of the Gods 1,000 years ago, the imperial tutor had followed the Azura god emperor into battle. He was one of the main forces that besieged and killed Kenshin. Therefore, not only were the 2 familiar and understood each other, but they also had a deep hatred. The imperial tutor purposely said this to test what Ji Tianxing was doing and why he didn't show up. He wanted to know if there was any conspiracy. However, Ji Tianxing wasn't provoked by him. He still sat in the cockpit of the god-slaying battleship, silently adjusting his breath with his eyes closed. In fact, he was waiting for the army led by Nangong Buhua to gather here. At the same time, the uneasiness in the depths of his heart still lingered. He didn't act rashly because he wanted to see what the imperial tutor had up his sleeves. However, it was obvious that the battle hadn't started yet. The imperial tutor was very calm and didn't show his trump card right from the start. The 2 sides were in a stalemate. The imperial tutor provoked him again, but Ji Tianxing didn't respond. Such an attitude made the imperial tutor feel despised and humiliated. He was furious. Therefore, he didn't ask for a rebuff. He simply ordered the soldiers on the cloud platform and ordered them to form a battle formation. The ordinary soldiers felt heavy and uneasy. They could only follow orders and didn't dare to talk or mock Ji Tianxing. However, the 12 divine generals beside the imperial tutor wanted to help the imperial tutor resolve the awkwardness. They all mocked Ji Tianxing and the Rebel Alliance. In their opinion, it would be best if they could anger the Kenshin and force the Rebel Alliance to attack earlier. However, Ji Tianxing seemed to have seen through their thoughts and tricks. He turned a deaf ear to their provocation and mockery. Time passed quietly. Half an hour passed quickly. A few divine lights lit up in the sky from the east of the secret realm's entrance. They were flying over at lightning speed. They were 11 divine battleships of different shapes. Each divine battleship carried more than 900 people or more than 1,000 people. This was the army of 11 factions led by Nangong Buhua. There were nearly 10,000 people in total. Swoosh! Under the gazes of countless people, this fleet streaked across the sky and stopped at the entrance of the grotto heaven. Nangong Buhua didn't meet up with Ji Tianxing. He also stopped 2,000 miles away from the cloud platform. Moreover, his and Ji Tianxing's fleets were 10,000 miles apart. One was in the east and the other was in the west. Of course, this wasn't Nangong Buhua's decision. It was Ji Tianxing's order. After the fleet stabilized, they immediately activated the attack formation and took out their divine cannons. They accumulated a lot of divine power. At the same time, Nangong Buhua and the leaders of the 10 factions all sent messages to Ji Tianxing to greet him. "Greetings, Alliance Leader. Greetings, Alliance Leader. This subordinate is late. I've kept Lord Alliance Master waiting for so long. Please punish me." The last sentence was naturally said by Nangong Buhua. The 2 fleets had agreed on a time to arrive at the entrance of the Azura Grotto Heaven at the same time. However, Nangong Buhua was 1 hour late. Ji Tianxing stopped resting and stood up. He looked out of the divine battleship and emitted a powerful aura. He sent a voice transmission to Nangong Buhua and asked, "Although I'm 1 hour late, it doesn't affect the overall situation. Did anything unexpected happen on your way here?" In the past hour, he was most worried that the imperial tutor had planted some trump cards and took the opportunity to kill Nangong Buhua's fleet. Nangong Buhua quickly replied, "Sorry for making you worry. Nothing unexpected happened." Chapter 4167. Ji Tianxing had already analyzed how the imperial tutor would use his trump card if he really had a trump card. There were only 2 possibilities. Either he would kill Nangong Buhua's army on the way, or he would ambush in the Shura Grotto Heaven and launch a surprise attack at the critical moment. Since Nangong Buhua's fleet had arrived, the first possibility was eliminated. "I want to see what you have up your sleeve." Ji Tianxing raised his eyebrows and looked at the imperial tutor on the cloud platform as he muttered to himself. The next moment he flew out of the god-slaying battleship and landed on the top of the battleship. He stood proudly in the wind and exuded a powerful aura that could suppress everything in the world. He stared at the imperial tutor and said in a dignified tone, "If this is all you have, then you'd better stretch out your neck and die. Don't waste time." The imperial tutor frowned and said with a cold smile, "Kenshin, I haven't seen you for 1,000 years, but you're still as arrogant as before." "Humph, it seems that you've been too arrogant because of your previous triumphant progress. Do you know that this is the day I've been waiting for? I want to beat you down to the ground and kill you on the spot when you're at your most arrogant moment. Only then can you experience the feeling of falling from the peak to hell and know what despair is." Ji Tianxing raised his eyebrows and a thought-provoking smile appeared on the corners of his mouth. He asked, "Just you and the soldiers under your command? Do you have the confidence to do so? Tell me, what's your trump card? Is it the Shura God Emperor? Tell him to stop hiding and come out for a fight." Even though his words were probing, he already had a 70% chance of knowing what the imperial preceptor was relying on. The imperial tutor did not show any reaction, but he was laughing coldly in his heart. "Kenshin, if you're afraid, just say it. Just admit defeat and surrender. Why do you have to talk so much nonsense?" The imperial tutor looked at Ji Tianxing expressionlessly and said in a cold voice, "As long as you admit defeat and surrender, even if this old man says that I will spare your life, you will not believe me. You must die, but this old man can give you a dignified death. In addition, this old man will not pursue the crimes of the dozen or so forces under your command. What do you think? Isn't this old man magnanimous enough?" Ji Tianxing couldn't be bothered with his words. He raised his hand and gave the order to attack. In a split second, the deity-slaying battleship was the first to open fire. It released 600 destructive light beams that bombarded the entrance of the Azura Paradise. The 20 divine warships of the two armies followed closely behind. They also released thousands of light pillars that blasted toward the cloud platform in a radius of 100 miles. The sky, which had been calm and tranquil just a moment ago, was instantly covered by a dazzling divine light, turning into a colorful world. Facing the bombardment of the light pillars, the nearly 10,000 soldiers on the cloud platform did not panic. Immediately, someone activated the defensive formation. There was no need for the imperial tutor or the divine generals to give the order. Tens of thousands of soldiers worked together to unleash their ultimate skills and launched a counterattack. Swish, 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 swish. Tens of thousands of blades of divine light and all kinds of wind, fire, and lightning surged toward the two armies of the Rebel Alliance like a flood. In the next moment, the divine light torrent and the thousands of light pillars collided violently. There was a loud explosion that shook the 9 heavens. Boom, 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 boom. The deafening sound reverberated in the sky. The area around the entrance of the Azura Paradise became a battlefield. It was drowned in the 5-colored divine light. Countless light pillars and divine art projections collapsed. Billions of fragments of divine light burst out and rained down from the sky. The violent and devastating shockwaves were like rings of multicolored ripples, constantly spreading outwards and crashing into the surrounding mountains. In the blink of an eye, the area within a radius of 50,000 miles was razed to the ground. The mountains and forests disappeared, turning into scorched earth and ruins. Even the sea of clouds in the sky was dispelled. Dozens of pitch-black spatial rifts were torn open in the sky. Under such an earth-shattering collision and explosion, the cloud platform suspended high in the sky was not destroyed. This was because the joint counterattack of tens of thousands of soldiers had destroyed more than half of the light pillars. The remaining half of the light pillars crashed into the cloud platform's defensive array and shattered. The supreme-grade king-level defensive array also trembled violently. Dozens of cracks appeared on it. All this time, when the Rebel Alliance had occupied nearly 100 regions of the boundless heaven continent, the domain chief's manor in each region was only protected by a supreme-grade king-level defensive array. This was the Azura Paradise, the home of the Azura God Emperor. It was the most majestic place in the entire boundless heaven continent. The defensive array at the entrance of the Azura Paradise was, of course, supreme-grade king-level defensive array. Even inside the Azura Paradise, Many important palaces, mansions and treasure vaults were protected by supreme-grade king-level divine arrays. Although the two armies of the Rebel Alliance had joined forces to attack for the first time, they did not break through the cloud platform's defensive array. In the eyes of the Imperial Tutor and the others, the defensive array was indestructible and invincible. They did not expect that the Rebel Alliance's first round of attack would cause cracks to appear on the defensive array. This made the soldiers' hearts skip a beat. They had a bad premonition. Before the Imperial Tutor and the others could react, Ji Tianxing waved the divine hammer again. A few beams of dazzling light smashed into the defensive array. The Imperial Tutor and the many heavenly generals came back to their senses. They immediately cast spells to resist and protect the defensive array. However, they were one step too slow. After a few loud bangs, the defensive array shook violently again. It was on the verge of collapse. Following a series of cracking sounds, a few more cracks appeared on the huge defensive light barrier. Moreover, the dozens of cracks from before had expanded several times. 2 gaps had appeared. Unfortunately, the gaps were not big. They were only 30 feet long and wide. It was not suitable for the Rebel Alliance's fleet to enter. Therefore, Ji Tianxing and the 21 divine battleships of the Rebel Alliance launched a second round of attack. The Imperial Tutor hurriedly ordered the heavenly generals and godly kings to cast spells to replenish the defensive array's energy and quickly repair the gaps and cracks in the array. This was the key defense of the Shura Grotto heaven. It was the second barrier. It could not be broken so easily. The nearly 10,000 soldiers on the cloud platform and the 5,000 soldiers in the surroundings immediately seized this opportunity to cast spells and besiege the 21 divine battleships of the Rebel Alliance. Boom, boom, boom. Tens of thousands of divine light blades and various divine spells poured down like a torrential flood. They drowned the 21 divine battleships. Only the god-slaying battleship blocked the attacks and remained unscathed. The other 20 king-level divine battleships suffered varying degrees of damage. Many dents and cracks appeared on the surface of the battleships. If the 15,000 soldiers under the Imperial Tutor attacked a few more times, the 20 divine battleships would be destroyed. Therefore, clan leader Wanyan Nangong Buhua and the others roared and led their soldiers to charge out. Kill. Break through the Shura Grotto heaven and kill the Shura divine palace. This is the moment to decide the victory. The clan leaders and sect leaders shouted as they led their soldiers to attack. They began to fight with the enemy. Book Guest House Reading Website. Chapter 4168. A full-scale war broke out. The god-slaying battleships and the 21 godly battleships attacked the defensive array at the Grotto Heaven's entrance with all their might. Ji Tianxing and the 20 clan leaders and sect masters led 20,000 soldiers to fight against the 15,000 soldiers under the Imperial Tutor's command. The Imperial Tutor originally wanted to maintain his dignity and posture as the commander-in-chief. He wanted to stay on the battlefield and command his soldiers to fight. However, when he saw Kenshin personally leading the charge, he had no choice but to join the battle. He couldn't just watch as his godly kings and generals were killed one by Kenshin, could he? Thus, the battle reached an extremely intense level not long after it started. The Rebel Alliance unleashed all their potential in order to obtain the final victory. They charged forward without any regard for the consequences. Even Yun Yao, Ji Ku Baifeng and Chao Qingyu joined the battle. It was worth mentioning that Ji Wuhan, who had broken through to the godly king realm not long ago, Ji Wushuang, Zhenhong Lin Shui, and the others also joined the battle. Now, the dozen or so people who followed Ji Tianxing had all become godly kings. None of them were weak. The Imperial Tutor's soldiers didn't fight for honor or dignity. They only fought for their lives. They fought with all their might regardless of the cost. In order to block the Rebel Alliance's ferocious attacks, the 15,000 soldiers took out all kinds of trump cards and used their life-saving divine artifacts and methods. There were even some who were seriously injured and knew that they would die for sure. They brazenly used forbidden secret techniques or self-destructed. Those who used forbidden secret techniques and sacrificed their divine bodies, lifespan and cultivation to temporarily gain super powerful combat strength were still manageable. However, the few godly kings who were forced into a corner and self-destructed when they knew that they would die for sure did cause a huge commotion on the battlefield. They caused a terrifying amount of destruction. After all, self-destruction was an indiscriminate attack. It didn't differentiate between friend and foe. Boom, boom, boom. After several earth-shattering explosions, several colorful mushroom clouds appeared on the battlefield. In the blink of an eye, the destructive five-colored shockwaves swept across hundreds of thousands of miles, flattening countless mountains and forests. Because of the self-destruction of the 5 godly kings, more than 1,000 godly monarchs of the rebel alliance were killed and more than 2,000 were injured. Nearly 1,000 of the Imperial Tudor soldiers were blown to smithereens, and more than 1,000 were severely injured. The losses on both sides were similar, but the Imperial Tudor was so depressed that he wanted to vomit blood. There was nothing he could do about it. Those 5 high-level divine kings who had self-detonated were all capable generals under his command. They were basically the first batch of region masters who had received orders to return. In the end, before these 5 capable assistants could do much, they were forced to self-destruct. If they died, then so be it. Why did they have to kill over 1,000 of their own people and injure over 1,000 others? The number of soldiers under the Imperial Tudor's command was already small to begin with, and now the situation was even worse. This already made the Imperial Tudor very depressed. But what made him even angrier and more aggrieved was yet to come. After the battle began, Xianxia had been staring at the godly generals and high-level divine kings around him, specifically targeting the stronger ones. The Imperial Tudor used all his strength every time, wanting to fight Xianxia head-on. But Xianxia easily neutralized his attacks. He did not take advantage of the situation to counterattack. Instead, he killed the other godly generals and high-level divine kings instantly. None of the region masters and godly generals of the 7th and 8th tier of the godly king realm were a match for Xianxia. They could only be killed instantly. The Imperial Tudor was also a peak-level divine king, but he admitted that he could not do this. Seeing that the number of capable generals around him was rapidly decreasing, the Imperial Tudor was very worried, but at the same time he was also very shocked and frightened. Before this, he already knew that Xianxia's strength could be said to be invincible below the God Emperor. Otherwise, he would not have been able to kill the Grand Marshal so easily. However, the Imperial Tudor did not have a clear idea of how strong Xianxia was. Now that they were fighting, he finally experienced it. It was not an exaggeration to say that when he fought Xianxia, he felt as oppressive as when he was facing the Azure God Emperor. In his opinion, Xianxia's combat strength seemed to be close to the Azure God Emperor's. This news was very shocking and hard to believe. 15 minutes later, the battle between the two armies paused for a moment. 4,000 of the 15,000 soldiers under the Imperial Tudor's command had been killed. Moreover, the number of mid-level godly kings and above who were killed was also very high. The remaining 11,000 soldiers took advantage of the situation to retreat and catch their breath. Of the 20,000 soldiers of the Rebel Alliance, more than 3,000 had died in battle. The remaining 16,000 had retreated 1,000 miles and were catching their breath under the protection of the fleet. On the surface, it seemed that the Rebel Alliance did not have any advantage. However, in reality, the Rebel Alliance had the upper hand and had the advantage. After all, the Imperial Tudor's army had the protection of that supreme-grade king-level divine formation. The number of godly kings who had died was even higher. The reason why both sides had stopped fighting temporarily was because the defensive formation at the Grotto Heaven's entrance was already filled with cracks and was on the verge of collapse. At this moment, Xianxia finally took out the famous Sword of Burial of Heaven. Sword of World Annihilation. He absorbed a huge amount of the power of the autonomous realm and held the Sword of Burial of Heaven with both hands. He condensed a brilliant golden sword that was tens of thousands of feet long and ruthlessly slashed at the formation. This sword was open and above board, filled with boundless domineering and destructive power. It was such a gorgeous and domineering sword. It did not seem to have any tricks or schemes, but it gave the Imperial Tudor and the others tremendous pressure. As a result, the Imperial Tudor and the soldiers found it difficult to breathe. Their hearts were filled with fear. They knew that this sword could very well destroy the defensive formation, but no one could muster the courage to block it. Kaboom! In the next moment, the golden sword slashed at the 5-colored light barrier within a 100-mile radius, creating an earth-shattering sound. Under everyone's gaze, the supreme-grade king-level defensive light barrier was split in half. In the process of its collapse, The dense cracks on the light barrier exploded, causing the entire light barrier to explode and burst into billions of fragments. Whoosh! The destructive shockwave carried with it endless fragments of divine light and swept in all directions, affecting thousands of soldiers. The sword of world annihilation, which had lost more than half of its power, also slashed into the crowd with a loud bang. Fortunately, the imperial tutor and the godly generals managed to dodge in time and were not split into pieces. However, more than 2,000 soldiers were killed on the spot. These people were either swept up by the shockwave and shattered into pieces on the spot, or they were struck by the sword of world annihilation and crushed into pieces without leaving behind a corpse. In addition to the 2,000 soldiers who were killed, more than 1,000 soldiers were severely injured and were in a miserable state. Even the imperial preceptor and a few divine generals were left in a sorry state with ashen faces. Great. Haha. It's finally broken. Without the protection of the formation, all of you can die. The soldiers of the Rebel Alliance were already prepared. They retreated thousands of miles away and were covered by the fleet, so there were not many casualties. Seeing Ji Tianxing shatter the defensive formation with one strike, more than 10,000 soldiers cheered excitedly and shouted in unison. At this moment, the morale of the soldiers on both sides were greatly reduced. On one hand, they were ashen-faced and full of fear and trepidation. On the other hand, their morale was very high. The more they fought, the braver they became. Chapter 4169. The morale of the Rebel Alliance's army was high, and their battle cries shook the heavens. The more than 9,000 soldiers under the imperial tutor's command were trembling with fear. Before the imperial tutor gave the order to retreat, many of the soldiers couldn't help but retreat to the grotto heaven's entrance. As long as the imperial tutor gave the order, they could immediately pass through the space gate and escape back to the Shura grotto heaven. The imperial tutor certainly knew that the current situation was not suitable for battle. He had to retreat back to the Shura grotto heaven and let the soldiers rest for a while to stabilize their morale. Only then could they compete with the Rebel Alliance. However, he couldn't give the order to retreat directly. Otherwise, the more than 9,000 soldiers would panic and rush to the grotto heaven's entrance like a swarm of bees. There would definitely be problems. He could only let the soldiers maintain their formation and retreat into the grotto heaven in an orderly manner. He and the many divine generals couldn't retreat first. They had to bring up the rear for the soldiers and prevent the Rebel Alliance from pursuing them. How could the Rebel Alliance let go of such a great opportunity? Seeing the imperial tutor's soldiers retreating quickly, Ji Tianxing decisively waved his divine sword and gave chase. More than 10,000 soldiers also let out battle cries and used all kinds of divine powers to attack the imperial tutor's soldiers. Swoosh swoosh swoosh. Divine light danced in the sky as all kinds of destructive divine arts poured down like a torrential flood, bombarding the imperial preceptor and thousands of soldiers. If it was a normal battle, the imperial tutor's side would be at a disadvantage, but they could resist and neutralize the attacks with all their might. However, it was different now. The imperial tutor's soldiers were in a hurry to escape and didn't have the heart to continue fighting. More than 2,000 people had already escaped back to the grotto heaven. Another 2,000 were retreating and only 5,000 soldiers were casting spells to resist. It wasn't hard to imagine that they wouldn't be able to withstand the fierce attacks of Ji Tianxing and more than 10,000 soldiers. Bang bang bang. A series of muffled explosions sounded. Dazzling divine light burst out from the crowd, and deafening loud noises sounded. Many people were blasted into smithereens on the spot. Not even their corpses remained. There were still many soldiers who were lucky enough to survive, but they were heavily injured. Their appearance was extremely miserable and their combat strength was severely weakened. Fortunately, the imperial tutor and the heavenly generals did their best to cast spells and protect the soldiers as they retreated. Otherwise, their casualties would be even more tragic. In this round of ferocious attacks, another 500 soldiers were killed and close to 1,000 were injured. The imperial tutor was also anxious. He began to urge his subordinates to hurry back to the Azura paradise. Ji Tianxing and the soldiers of the Rebel Alliance did not stop. They immediately cast powerful spells and launched a second round of fierce attacks on the imperial tutor. The imperial tutor and the divine generals were beaten to a pulp, their injuries worsening. Thousands of soldiers were also beaten into a sorry state. They covered their heads and fled like rats. The number of casualties continued to increase. Finally, 100 breaths had passed. The imperial tutor's subordinates all retreated back to the Azura paradise. Even the imperial tutor and the divine generals who brought up the rear turned around and entered the spatial gate. At this time, the imperial preceptor's 9,000-plus soldiers were only left with around 5,000. At least 4,000 soldiers were killed in the process of retreating, and more than 20 divine kings were taken care of by Zhou Xian. The imperial tutor's forces were further weakened. Even if they escaped back to the Azura paradise, they did not have much of a chance of winning. Zhou Xian reckoned that when the anti-rebels alliance breached the entrance of the Grotto Heaven and slaughtered the Shura Grotto Heaven, Emperor Preceptor's trump card would be revealed. After the imperial tutor and the others escaped to the Azura paradise, they hurriedly closed the entrance. The 300 feet tall spatial gate disappeared. In the seemingly empty sky, there was actually an invisible spell formation. If they could crack or break that spell formation, they would be able to enter the Azura paradise. More than 10,000 soldiers were filled with killing intent and high morale. They were about to charge forward and break that spell formation together. However, Zhou Xian raised his hand to stop them. He could already see that the entrance to the Azura paradise was also a supreme-grade king-level divine array. If more than 10,000 soldiers attacked together in addition to the 21 divine warships, they could indeed break that spell formation. However, it would take a lot of time and the amount of divine power it would consume was immeasurable. Zhou Xian let the soldiers rest while he took the opportunity to treat their injuries. He used the God's Eye mystic technique to carefully observe the invisible spell formation, looking for a way to break it. Although the Azura God Emperor had personally set up the spell formation at the entrance of the Azura paradise, it was very profound and exquisite. However, Zhou Xian was most proficient in the sword Dao and the array Dao, and his attainments in them were also extraordinarily high. After observing for a few minutes, he figured out the structure of the spell formation. He frowned and pondered. After deducing for a few minutes, he found a way to break it. Then he started to cast spells to break the spell formation. Yun Yao, Ji Ku, Bai Feng, and the other god kings were assisting him at any time. It was much easier to find a way to break the spell formation. Originally, Zhou Xian would have needed a few hours to break this spell formation. However, with the help of so many god kings, he only needed an hour to successfully break a hole in the spell formation. Then, everyone worked together to enlarge that hole by more than 10 times, making it 30,000 feet long and wide. Everyone boarded the divine warships and flew into the Azura paradise under the lead of the god-slaying warships. After the imperial tutor fled back to the Azura paradise with the remaining 5,000 soldiers, he wanted to set up an ambush at the entrance of the Azura paradise. He knew that Kenshin would definitely have a way to break the spell formation at the entrance of the Azura paradise and lead the fleet into the Azura paradise. If he could ambush them at the entrance, he would definitely be able to catch them off guard. However, the problem was that most of the 5,000 soldiers under the imperial tutor were either lightly or heavily injured. Their morale was also very low. In addition, there were 10,000 soldiers guarding the Azura Divine Palace. They could not be easily mobilized. The Azura Divine Palace was the most important. It was the final fortress. He could not afford to lose it. He could not mobilize the 10,000 soldiers. If he wanted to ambush the rebel alliance with just the 5,000 soldiers by his side, it would be no different from sending them to their deaths. With this thought, the imperial tutor dismissed the idea of an ambush. He simply took the 5,000 soldiers and obediently returned to the Azura Divine Palace. He let the injured soldiers rest and recuperate. Then he commanded the 10,000 soldiers guarding the Azura Divine Palace to prepare for war. After arranging all these matters, he thought to himself, these 15,000 soldiers and the spell formation around the Azura Divine Palace are our final barrier. Success or failure depends on this battle. Thinking of this, he subconsciously turned around and looked at the depths of the Azura Divine Palace. He silently prayed in his heart, in 6 hours, it will be 49 days. You should be done, right? If something goes wrong today, I'm afraid I won't be able to give you an explanation. I can only become a dead soul under Kenshin's sword. Everything depends on you. The imperial tutor pursed his lips. His expression and mood became very serious. His hand gripped the hilt of his divine sword tightly. He knew that it would take the rebel alliance at least a day to break into the Azura paradise. Even if Kenshin personally took action with the help of many god kings, it would still take several hours. There should be no problem with the top-grade king-level spell formation at the entrance lasting for 6 hours, right? End of chapter. Chapter 4170. In fact, Ji Tianxing, with the help of many god kings, took less than 2 hours to enter the Azura Paradise. He originally thought that the imperial tutor would set up traps and ambushes near the entrance of the paradise. This way, even if they couldn't destroy the Rebel Alliance's fleet, they could still severely injure them. However, the 5,000 soldiers under the imperial tutor were definitely not enough. At the very least, they would need to add the 10,000 soldiers guarding the Azura Divine Palace. If the imperial tutor was bold enough to do this, he would definitely reap some benefits. As for what the outcome would be, that was unknown. Unfortunately, the imperial tutor was never a bold or crazy person. He was more cautious than ordinary people. Therefore, Ji Tianxing was a little disappointed that he didn't see any ambushes near the entrance of the paradise. However, according to the usual practice, the imperial tutor had set up some traps and formations near the entrance of the paradise in advance. His goal was to create trouble for the Rebel Alliance and delay them. However, Ji Tianxing was already prepared. He used the Divine Eye secret technique to see through the traps and formations and avoided them one by one. As a result, the Rebel Alliance was indeed delayed a little, but it didn't matter much. The Azura Paradise was very big. It had a vast territory, rich resources, and abundant divine power. There was no need to say much about this. At this time, this beautiful world was filled with a heavy and oppressive atmosphere. Wherever the Rebel Alliance's fleet passed, there was no living person in sight. Ji Tianxing believed that the imperial tutor must have already dismissed the miscellaneous personnel and those who didn't have any combat strength. As for the imperial tutor's soldiers, they must have gathered near the Azura Divine Palace, waiting to fight to the death with the Rebel Alliance. Ji Tianxing wasn't in a hurry. The god-slaying battleship led the 20 battleships and advanced at a moderate pace, heading straight for the Azura Divine Palace. During the 400,000-mile journey, they naturally encountered many traps and ambushes. These were all set up by the imperial tutor a few months ago. Back then, the imperial tutor had already predicted that this day would come. However, Ji Tianxing was always able to detect danger in advance and cleverly avoid it. Half an hour later, the fleet arrived safely at the Azura Divine Palace. It was a group of palaces with a radius of 1,000 miles. There were more than 60 lofty mountains, and each mountain peak had palaces and residences. They were all luxuriously built. The main peak in the middle was also the most majestic peak. The palace at the top of the mountain was the most majestic and sacred. That was the Azura Divine Palace. The Rebel Alliance's fleet stopped 1,000 miles away from the palace complex. This was because the group of palaces had already activated the mountain protection formation, which covered a radius of 1,000 miles, and enveloped the dozens of mountains. This incomparably exquisite protective array was the most critical barrier of the Azura Divine Palace. It was a genuine top-grade king-level divine array. The 7-foot-thick dark red light barrier had endless blood flowing around it, releasing a soaring killing intent and a sharp aura. There were also 12,000 fully armed soldiers guarding the edge of the great array, glaring at the Rebel Alliance's fleet. The other 3,000 soldiers had suffered heavy injuries. They were the group that had retreated from the Heavenly Grotto entrance. At this moment, they were treating their injuries in the palace. The imperial tutor and the 9 divine generals stood in the air above the Azura Divine Palace's square, looking at the Rebel Alliance's fleet. At this point, this was the final battle. Both sides didn't waste any words and directly started fighting. The 21 battleships of the Rebel Alliance all activated their attack formations, crazily accumulating their divine power, and releasing an overwhelming barrage of cannon fire and pillars of divine power. Bang! 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 Deafening explosions erupted, resounding through the horizon. The dense pillars of light that filled the sky like a rain of arrows also ruthlessly bombarded the dark red mountain protection formation. Countless pillars of divine power exploded, bursting into millions of fragments of divine light. The dark red light barrier that spanned 1,000 miles shook violently, flashing with divine light. The cannon fire of the 20 high-grade King-level God battleships didn't damage the mountain protection formation. At most, they could only consume its energy. Only the several hundred pillars of light released by the God-slaying battleships managed to create several dozen cracks on the dark red light barrier. However, the light barrier was simply too thick, so a few cracks didn't matter. The Rebel Alliance's first round of attacks couldn't even shake the mountain protection formation. The 10,000 soldiers inside the formation laughed at them. The Imperial tutor waved his hand and gave the order for a counterattack. Thus, several hundred soldiers used their arts to control the mountain protection formation, releasing divine light that blotted out the sky and smashed into the Rebel Alliance's fleet like a flood. The reason why they used the mountain protection formation to counterattack and didn't let the 10,000 soldiers attack was to preserve their strength. The Imperial tutor knew that no matter how strong the Rebel Alliance was, they wouldn't be able to do anything to the mountain protection formation in the short term. He could use the mountain protection formation's power to consume the Rebel Alliance's strength. In addition, even if the 11,000 soldiers attacked with all their strength, they wouldn't be able to defeat the Rebel Alliance. It would be a waste of energy. It was better to stall for time and wait for that trump card to appear before fighting the Rebel Alliance to the death. That was the wiser move. The Imperial tutor's move was indeed effective. More than 10,000 soldiers remained in a spectating state, and only a few hundred soldiers controlled the mountain protection formation. They successfully stalled the Rebel Alliance. The 21 God battleships attacked with all their might, expending countless resources, and continuously releasing cannon fire and pillars of light to bombard the mountain protection formation. However, the mountain protection formation wasn't damaged. At most, the God-slaying battleships only managed to create some cracks. No matter how much the mountain protection formation shook and trembled, it was extremely safe inside the formation. There was no danger at all. The more than 10,000 soldiers under the Imperial tutor's command laughed even more arrogantly when they saw the Rebel Alliance's fleet bombarding the mountain protection formation to no avail. They mocked the Rebel Alliance without restraint, and their morale rose as well. They felt much more at ease. The mountain protection formation gave them a sense of security that was far more effective than the Imperial tutor's empty slogans. Just like that, the two sides were in a stalemate for about 15 minutes. The 21 God battleships of the Rebel Alliance continuously bombarded the mountain protection formation more than 100,000 times, consuming at least 200 billion worth of resources. Fortunately, Zhou Xian was now the richest person in the world and had hundreds of trillions worth of resources. That was why he could withstand such consumption. Unfortunately, even after consuming so many cultivation resources, they didn't achieve any results. The mountain protection formation was still intact. Even though there were many cracks and dents on its surface, it wasn't really broken. Under the control of hundreds of soldiers, the cracks and dents on the surface of the mountain protection formation were also slowly being repaired. At most, after half a day, those cracks and dents would disappear, and the mountain protection formation would be restored to its original state. This made Zhou Xian a little depressed. He could already tell that the Imperial tutor wanted to stall for time and weaken the Rebel Alliance's combat power before finding an opportunity to counterattack. Since that was the case, he definitely couldn't let the Imperial tutor get what he wanted. Thus, he decisively ordered the fleet to stop attacking and let the soldiers rest for a while. Then he asked the White Dragon to increase the power of the God-slaying battleships to the maximum and attack the mountain protection formation at all costs, concentrating on one point. He also held the Sword of Burial of Heaven and the Divine Hammer and attacked personally. End of chapter. Chapter 4171. Sword Rain. Before the Imperial tutor could react, Zhou Xian flew high into the sky, pointed his sword at the sky and let out an angry roar. He used all his strength and used his ultimate skill, vowing to break the protective formation as soon as possible. Dazzling starlight immediately lit up in the sky. 90,000 starlight dots appeared. The densely packed stars poured down like a meteor shower, bringing with them a terrifying power that could destroy the heavens and earth. Within the protective formation, the 10,000 soldiers were discussing and mocking. Why did the Rebel Alliance's fleet stop attacking? At this moment they saw the God-slaying battleship attacking the formation alone, and Kenshin was personally attacking. Everyone stopped mocking and sneering, and they sized up Kenshin with curiosity and vigilance. Everyone had heard of the sword god's fame and his terrifying strength and methods. It was only at this moment that they truly witnessed the sword god's most proficient sword technique. Countless people looked up at the sky and saw the dazzling stars in the sky, and they were shocked. In the next moment, they saw clearly that the 90,000 light spots falling from the sky were not stars. They were 90,000 giant swords of stars. Each giant sword was thousands of feet long, and they were condensed and contained supreme divine power that could destroy everything. The sword rain had not yet arrived, but the 10,000 soldiers could already feel the terrifying divine power and the terrifying sword intent. At this moment, they'd experienced exactly how formidable the sword god was. Everyone's expression became serious and grave, and their hearts were also in their mouths, and they were filled with deep worry. Previously they had been very confident in the protective formation, but now they could not help but feel worried and apprehensive. Could this invincible protective mountain array really block the sword god's ultimate sword technique? Just as the soldiers were in a daze, the imperial tutor came back to his senses and was also shocked. He shouted anxiously, "What are you waiting for?" Quickly, everyone worked together to support the formation. To be on the safe side, the imperial tutor had no choice but to order all the soldiers to use their arts to increase the power of the protective formation. The protective formation was too important and there could not be any mistakes. More than 10,000 soldiers came to their senses and hurriedly cast spells to increase the power of the protective formation. Unfortunately, they were still one step too slow. Boom, 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 boom. In the next instant, the 90,000 stellar swords slammed into the dark red protective formation with boundless divine might. An earth-shattering explosion erupted. It was deafening and it spread for tens of thousands of miles. The huge mountain guarding formation was immediately submerged by the boundless starlight. When it suffered the terrifying impact, it also shook violently. Previously, cracks and dents had appeared in the mountain protecting array. The god-slaying battleship had also concentrated its firepower on the damaged area. At this moment, the Rain of Swords was also under Ji Tianxing's control, deliberately bombarding that area repeatedly. Thus, amidst a series of loud rumbles, everyone clearly heard a burst of kacha-kacha shattering sound. The soldiers who were channeling their arts and injecting divine power into the protective formation subconsciously looked up. Then they saw a frightening scene. Under the continuous bombardment of the 90,000 giant swords, the incomparably thick protective mountain formation was actually densely packed with cracks in an area of 10,000 zhang in radius. The cracks were rapidly spreading, deepening and thickening. There were even dark red fragments of divine light bursting out. When the 90,000 star swords finished their first bombardment, the center of the fissure that was tens of thousands of feet wide had clearly caved in. The thousands of cracks also gradually gathered together, leaving only a few hundred cracks. At this moment, the cracks were basically tens of thousands of feet long and dozens of feet wide. Everyone's gaze could already see the sky outside through those cracks. Without a doubt, the protective formation that was said to be invincible had finally been breached. It was just that the cracked area had not collapsed yet, so there were no huge gaps or holes. But everyone knew that it was only a matter of time. Quickly cast spells to support the formation and repair the cracks. The imperial tutor's expression changed immediately. He anxiously roared and hurriedly cast spells to control the formation. More than 10,000 soldiers panicked. All of them channeled their divine power into the protective formation without caring about anything else. Although everyone tried their best to increase the strength of the formation and repair the cracks and holes, the speed of the formation was too slow. However, the speed of repair was simply too slow, far slower than the speed of destruction. After the first round of bombardment, only a little more than 20,000 of the 90,000 starry swords had exploded. There were still more than 60,000 stellar swords left, and they actually formed a huge sword formation in the sky, and continued to bombard the broken area. Whoosh whoosh whoosh. The sword lights flew back and forth as fast as lightning, emitting sharp whistling sounds. Bam bam bam. The stellar swords kept bombarding the cracked area, causing a series of loud, dull sounds and splashes of starlight and red light to fill the sky. Clearly, the stellar swords were constantly shattering and dissipating. But the cracked area was also constantly expanding, sinking and splashing divine light fragments. Everyone saw with their own eyes that the cracks in the area were rapidly expanding, and gaps and holes were gradually appearing. Such an outcome caused the soldiers under the imperial preceptor to be filled with worry and anxiety. On the other hand, the 10,000 soldiers of the rebel alliance were excited and spirited. They saw the hope of victory again. At this time, Ji Tianqing waved the divine hammer again and smashed out 98 beams of divine light continuously at the cracked area. Boom, boom, boom. Another loud explosion could be heard. That region began to shatter at an even faster rate, and even more fragments of divine light splashed out. The power of the formation was weakening, and the thickness of the light wall was decreasing. The gaps and holes were also getting bigger and bigger. As Ji Tianqing raised the sword of burial of heaven, he absorbed the power of the five elements world and slashed out a sword of annihilation. At this moment, not only the imperial tutor's pupils constricted, but his face was also full of shock. Even the 10,000 plus soldiers under his command felt their hearts skip a beat as their expressions changed drastically. Boom. Crack. The next moment, an earth-shattering sound burst out. Under everyone's watchful eyes, the sword of annihilation struck the protective mountain array and split the cracked area into millions of pieces. Countless dark red divine light fragments splashed out, and a huge gap with a radius of 10,000 feet appeared. Violent and devastating shock waves crashed into the protective mountain array, causing it to shake violently. The 11,000 soldiers in the array were also swept up by the shock waves. They were thrown off their feet and screamed in agony. Just like that, the imperial tutor's strongest barrier, the protective mountain array, was broken. At the same time, a few hundred soldiers were unlucky enough to be swept up by the shock waves and died on the spot. Next, Ji Tianqing didn't need to give any orders. The 21 divine warships, which had been ready for a long time, unleashed all their cannons and light beams toward the gap in the protective mountain array. Boom, boom, boom. Following a series of loud noises, the gap doubled in size and countless cracks appeared around it. In this way, it was impossible for the imperial tutor and his soldiers to repair the protective mountain array. Chapter 4172. Kill. The protective array has been broken. Kill them all. Victory belongs to us. The boundless heaven continent belongs to us. The protective array had been broken, causing the morale of the Rebel Alliance's soldiers to soar. They shouted excitedly, wanting to rush out of the divine warships and charge into the protective array to kill all the soldiers under the imperial tutor. Then the army would occupy the Azura divine palace and declare victory. However, Ji Tianqing did not give the order and the soldiers would not act on their own. They still followed the order, holding their weapons tightly and waiting patiently. The 21 divine warships were not in a hurry to rush into the protective array. They were still thousands of miles away from the array, constantly firing cannons and light beams. With every breath, thousands of cannons and light beams would pass through the gap in the protective array and blast toward the imperial tutor and the tens of thousands of soldiers. Ji Tianqing's goal was obvious. First, he would use the warship's cannons to kill the imperial tutor and his soldiers from a distance, further weakening the enemy's strength. When the enemy had suffered heavy casualties and their combat strength was weak, he would send the Rebel Alliance's army to charge into the protective array. By doing so, he could effectively preserve the strength of his side and reduce casualties. However, the disadvantage was also obvious, and that was that it consumed too many cultivation resources. However, Ji Tianqing controlled almost the entire boundless heaven continent and carried hundreds of trillions worth of resources with him. He did not care about this consumption at all. Boom. Boom, 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 boom. The cannons fired continuously, and the loud sounds echoed between heaven and earth. Inside the protective formation, the imperial preceptor and his subordinates were suffering unspeakably. Seeing that the protective array had been breached and the gap had expanded to a radius of 20 miles, the imperial tutor could only give the order to give up. He took the lead to use his ultimate skill and joined forces with the 11,000 soldiers to resist the bombardment of the anti-rebel fleet. Unfortunately, their strength was limited. At most, they could block and neutralize 80% of the cannons. In the end, 20% of the cannons and light beams would bombard the crowd, causing many casualties. With every breath, dozens of soldiers would be killed on the spot. It was a scene of flesh and blood flying in all directions. The area within a radius of 1,000 miles was drowned in dazzling divine light. As the imperial tutor held on, he repeatedly turned back to look at the Azura divine palace. He anxiously muttered in his heart, "We can't hold on any longer. Why haven't you made a move yet?" However, the powerhouse he was relying on didn't seem to hear his prayers. There was no response from the Azura Divine Palace. 100 breaths of time quickly passed. At this moment, more than half of the mountains and forests within 1,000 miles of the protective formation had been destroyed. At least 100 palaces and residences were blown into ruins by the overwhelming cannon fire and pillars of light. Only half of the palaces were protected by defensive formations and could still hold on. However, there was no doubt that the palaces and mountains protected by the formation would not be able to hold on for long and would eventually turn into dust. The imperial tutor and many of the god kings were injured, and over 2,000 of the 11,000 soldiers were killed. Only 9,000 soldiers were still bitterly holding on. However, their combat strength was rapidly weakening as they were forced to retreat by the overwhelming cannon fire. The imperial tutor's heart was burning with anxiety. He could only order the 3,000 soldiers who were hiding in the palace to treat their injuries to join the battle. These 12,000 soldiers were the last of the imperial tutor's forces. If these soldiers were also killed, then he would have no soldiers to use. At that time, even if that trump card appeared, he would be powerless to reverse the situation and would not be able to defeat the rebel alliance. After all, the rebel alliance still had more than 16,000 soldiers. Moreover, they were in peak condition and had ample combat strength. Boom, boom, boom. The anti-rebel fleet's cannon fire continued. The soldiers operating the divine warships had never been so happy and excited as they were at this moment. Inside the protective formation, palaces and residences were destroyed one after another, and batches of the Azura God Emperor's minions were killed. They were in high spirits. Another 100 breaths of time passed. The imperial tutor and the divine generals were in an even more sorry state. They were all covered in wounds and their hair was disheveled. 2,000 of the 12,000 soldiers had also been killed. Only 10,000 soldiers were left. The imperial tutor knew that he could not continue fighting like this. In at most an hour, the last 10,000 soldiers would be completely wiped out. Therefore, he could only lead the 10,000 soldiers to retreat as they fought and retreated toward the Azura Divine Palace. Seeing this, the rebel alliance's fleet was not in a hurry to chase after them. Under the command of Xianxia, they first concentrated their firepower on the protective formation and further widened the gap. In a short while, half of the protective formation was destroyed. The remaining half of the dark red light barrier also collapsed and dissipated into the air. The protective formation was completely destroyed. Even if the Azura God Emperor came personally, he would not be able to repair it in a short time. Xianxia was finally relieved and ordered all the soldiers to attack. Swish, swish, swish. 15,000 soldiers of various races rushed out of the 20 divine warships. 200 to 300 people stayed behind on each divine warship. They were responsible for controlling the divine warships and continuing to suppress the imperial tutor's army with firepower. Xianxia, the patriarchs, and the powerhouses led the 15,000 soldiers and steadily approached the Azura Divine Palace. Seeing that the imperial preceptor and his soldiers had lost their barrier, they suffered heavy casualties in the sky filled with cannon fire, and their numbers decreased sharply. They could only escape into the final fortress, the Azura Divine Palace. The Azura Divine Palace was protected by 2 layers of top-grade divine arrays. Its defensive power was stronger than the protective formation and more difficult to destroy. The imperial tutor calculated that as long as they hid in the Azura Divine Palace and supported the protective formation with all their strength, they would be able to delay for a few hours. As for after a few hours, if their trump card did not appear, they could only perish. With this thought in mind, the imperial tutor personally cast a spell and opened the gates of the Azura Divine Palace. Ka. The 1,000-foot-tall bronze gates slowly opened. The imperial tutor and his soldiers were about to cross the gates and rush into the Azura Divine Palace. At this moment, a boundless blood-colored torrent suddenly surged out from the spacious hall behind the gates. Shwa! The blood-colored torrent surged out, carrying with it a boundless divine might and bloody intent. It flew into the air above the square outside the divine palace. Under the gazes of more than 20,000 people, this 10,000-foot-long torrent of blood-colored torrent twisted and condensed in the air, quickly condensing into a human figure. Divine light flashed and bloody flames rose. A 1,000-foot-tall divine spirit with 6 blood-colored wings on its back appeared in front of everyone. This blood-red divine spirit was covered in pitch-black armor formed from the aura of death, covering 80% of its body. It had a massive head, long purple hair and 6 blood-colored wings. It also had a ferocious and majestic face. Like a huge mountain, he hovered over the square, gazing at the soldiers of the anti-rebellious league with an expressionless face. Suddenly, the 15,000 soldiers felt a surge of pressure. Fear and awe rose in their hearts and they couldn't help but stop in their tracks. The imperial tutor and his soldiers all revealed expressions of surprise and disbelief. They let out earth-shattering cheers. Chapter 4173. His Majesty the God Emperor. His Majesty the God Emperor has returned. Greetings, His Majesty the God Emperor. At this moment, the imperial tutor and the nearly 10,000 soldiers under his command all exclaimed in excitement and disbelief. Everyone was excited and pleasantly surprised and they could not help but shout. A moment ago they were still worried, anxious and desperate. But now their hanging hearts had all settled back into their stomachs, and they smiled as if they had been relieved of a heavy burden and had survived a disaster. The battle was not over yet, and the outcome of the battle was still uncertain. But in the hearts of these 10,000 soldiers, they had already won and they were safe. Because their supreme overlord, the Azura God Emperor, had returned. In their knowledge, only the Azura God Emperor was truly invincible. Although Kenshin was powerful and terrifying, he could not be compared to the Azura God Emperor. That's right, that giant black-armored god thousands of feet tall was like the Grim Reaper who controlled hell. He was the famous Azura God Emperor. Ever since the Azura God Emperor ruled the boundless heaven continent, he had handed over the power to the imperial tutor and the Meng Shuai. And he was obsessed with studying the mystery of the gray fog in the outer void, and he almost never asked about the boundless heaven continent's affairs, and he basically never showed his face. Even so, there were statues of him in every city on the boundless heaven continent. Therefore, as long as it was a citizen of the boundless heaven continent, there was no one who did not know the Azura God Emperor. While the Emperor's preceptor and the 10,000 soldiers were cheering, the 15,000 soldiers of the Anti-Rebels Alliance were also dumbfounded. The 20 divine warships stopped attacking, and the soldiers operating the divine warships were stunned. Even the White Dragon was stunned. It paused for a moment before continuing to release cannon fire and light pillars. The 15,000 soldiers of the 20 ancient clans and sects were also stunned in place, staring at the Azura God Emperor with their mouths agape. Everyone's eyes widened and their faces turned ugly. Deep fear was hidden in their eyes. In fact, many of the Divine Lord Realm experts who were slightly less courageous had their heads bowed, their faces ashen. They couldn't withstand the killing intent and pressure of the Azura God Emperor. As the saying goes, a person's name is like a tree's shadow. The 5 God Emperors were supreme and invincible gods in the eyes of all living beings in the God realm. This concept, after thousands of years of accumulation, had long been deeply rooted. Even if these 15,000 soldiers had followed the powerful Kenshin and won every battle, they would never have been defeated. However, the appearance of the Azura God Emperor filled their hearts with fear and despair. It was as if they were witnessing the descent of death. It couldn't be helped. In everyone's subconscious, there was a conclusion. Although Kenshin was strong, he was still no match for the Azura God Emperor. At the very least, the current Kenshin wasn't qualified yet. Therefore, the faces of the 20 patriarchs and sect leaders were very ugly, and they were also very guilty. They had already expected that today's ending would be rewritten. All their previous victories would be overturned. The Rebel Alliance was on the verge of conquering the Azura Divine Palace and completely controlling the boundless heaven continent. However, with the appearance of the Azura God Emperor, the Imperial Tutor would be able to make a comeback. That's right. To the Imperial Preceptor and the 10,000 soldiers under his command, this was a reversal of the situation. When the Azura God Emperor appeared, Ji Tianxing subconsciously stopped in his tracks and frowned as he stared at the other party. At this time a thought flashed through his mind. As I expected, the Imperial Tutor's final trump card can only be the Azura God Emperor. In fact, this was a very simple question without any suspense. Even the God Generals and God Kings under the Imperial Tutor felt a sense of realization when they saw the Azura God Emperor appear. Hearing the imperial tutor and the soldiers shouting the name of the Azura God Emperor and saluting with fanaticism, Ji Tianxing raised his eyebrows. He used the divine eye secret technique and stared at the Azura God Emperor, carefully observing and analyzing. At first he was also a little shocked, thinking that the Azura God Emperor's original body had returned. If that was the case, then he didn't have the confidence to defeat the Azura God Emperor. However, he still thought that it was unlikely. In the eyes of the Azura God Emperor, the mystery of the gray fog in the outer space was definitely more important than the boundless heaven continent. And the facts proved that Ji Tianxing's analysis was completely correct. After careful observation, he discovered that the Azura God Emperor in front of him was not the original body but an avatar. However, this avatar was a little strange. It seemed to have been refined using some sort of refining and sacrificial method, so that this avatar was very similar to the original body, and there were almost no flaws. Because of this, except for the imperial tutor, the tens of thousands of soldiers all thought that the Azura God Emperor's original body had returned. Now that he was sure that this was the Azura God Emperor's avatar, Ji Tianxing breathed a sigh of relief. He didn't have much confidence in dealing with the Azura God Emperor's original body. However, he was confident in dealing with an avatar, even if it was a specially enhanced version. At this moment, the Azura God Emperor looked down at Ji Tianxing and spoke. Longtian, you didn't think that this emperor would be waiting for you here, did you? The Azura God Emperor's voice was deep like muffled thunder, and it reverberated between heaven and earth, containing a powerful aura and intimidation. However, Ji Tianxing stood proudly in front of him, and his aura were not suppressed in the slightest. Is it that hard to guess? For nearly half a year the imperial tutor has no one he can use, and he hasn't made any moves or plans. He's been waiting for death. However, he's not in a hurry and he looks as if he has a card up his sleeve. I can guess that you must have informed him that you'll be back at the critical moment. Otherwise, how could he have been so calm? The Azura God Emperor frowned and his crimson eyes flashed with a cold sneer. That's true. If you can't even analyze this, then you don't deserve to be called a Kenshin. You've been invincible for the past year and you've conquered 99 domains. But now that this emperor has returned, everything you've done will be for naught. You're a smart person and you should know that you've already lost. Stop wasting time, admit defeat and surrender. The Azura God Emperor stared at Ji Tianxing, and his calm voice carried an unquestionable domineering tone. Ji Tianxing chuckled. If your true body had returned, perhaps you would have the right to say such words. But you've only sent an avatar back and you want to make a comeback? You underestimate this emperor too much and overestimate yourself too much. You should know very well that the avatars of the other fellows have already been destroyed by this emperor. And your avatar will meet the same fate. Ji Tianxing's voice wasn't loud, but it was full of energy and confidence, and it spread clearly across the battlefield. Hearing his words, the 10,000 soldiers under the imperial tutor were stunned, and their excitement dissipated. Many of them revealed looks of astonishment. It's not the true body of His Majesty the God Emperor but an avatar? This thought flashed through the minds of the 10,000 soldiers, and they were somewhat disappointed. The 16,000 soldiers of the Rebel Alliance were also stunned for a moment, and then they breathed a sigh of relief and their expressions relaxed. It's not the true body but an avatar? That's good, we still have a chance. End of chapter. Chapter 4174. The arrival of the Azura God Emperor himself and the arrival of his avatar were two completely different concepts. Many God Kings understood that the avatar of the Azura God Emperor only had about 10% of the original strength. Avatars could move freely and were not restricted by distance, making them very convenient to use. The 5 God Emperors would all refine avatars to take the place of their original bodies and handle affairs. Although the avatar only had 10% of the original strength, it was still a bona fide God Emperor, far surpassing the God King realm. Even a peak God King would have no chance of victory against the avatar of the God Emperor. But the current situation was different. Although Ji Tianxing was a peak God King, his true fighting strength had long surpassed the God King realm. In everyone's view, his strength was already very close to the God Emperor realm, and there was not much of a difference between him and the 5 God Emperors. One could well imagine that the avatar of the Azura God Emperor was most likely no match for Ji Tianxing. Thus, the imperial Tudor soldiers were somewhat disappointed, their morale low and their hearts filled with worry. As for the more than 10,000 soldiers of the rebel alliance, the worry and fear in their hearts dissipated, and they all breathed a sigh of relief. Everyone was filled with anticipation, waiting to see the battle between Zhou Xian and the avatar of the Azure God Emperor. Everyone had heard that Kenshin had killed several avatars of the God Emperor before returning to the God realm. But that was only hearsay. No one had seen it with their own eyes and no one had heard the details of the battle, so they had no idea. But today was different. Everyone present was blessed with the opportunity to witness a battle between supreme gods with their own eyes. How could they not be excited, agitated, and expectant? Seeing everyone's reaction, the avatar of the Azure God Emperor sneered, his eyes full of contempt. Long Tian, in truth, this emperor returned to the boundless heaven continent 50 days ago. Do you know why this emperor waited until today to appear? This sudden sentence caused everyone present to be stunned for a moment. Zhou Xian also frowned as he stared at the Azure God Emperor's incarnation. Immediately he guessed something and replied with a sneer, "You returned to the boundless heaven continent 50 days ago, but you didn't dare to make a move against me. It's nothing more than knowing your own limitations and knowing that you're not my match. Therefore, in these 50 days, you used some kind of crooked method to refine your incarnation to become even more powerful. Only then would you have the confidence to deal with me." The external incarnation of an emperor god expert was like a divine weapon or an item. The avatars could not cultivate or comprehend divine techniques, and their divine power could not be recovered quickly. Therefore, there was no way to increase their battle prowess. However, the Azure God Emperor treated his avatar as a divine tool. He used certain sacrificial techniques to strengthen his avatar and add some power to it. During these 49 days, the Azure God Emperor's incarnation had remained in the depths of the divine palace, refining the blood soul altar. For this, the Azure God Emperor had spent more than $1 trillion worth of cultivation resources and sacrificed the lives of 98,000 heavenly gods. Those 98,000 heavenly gods were all citizens of the boundless heaven continent. Half of them were Protoss and the other half were foreign races. As early as half a year ago, the Imperial Tutor had received the Azure God Emperor's message and order to carry out this mission in secret. The Imperial Tutor had sent his most trusted subordinates and generals to various regions to secretly search for suitable targets. Half of the 98,000 heavenly gods to be sacrificed were men and women. 20% of them were boys and 20% of them were old men. In addition, the attributes of these people's divine power, aptitude, and bloodline levels also had corresponding requirements. All in all, it was not easy to find 98,000 qualified sacrificial offerings, and to do it secretly without any information being leaked. Only an expert like the Imperial Preceptor, who controlled the entire continent and had immense power, could do it quietly. If it were any other faction, they could not do it secretly. The Azure God Emperor looked down at Zhou Xian and the Rebel Alliance soldiers and sneered with murderous intent. In these 49 days, 98,000 heavenly gods have completed the sacrifice in the blood soul altar, offering their blood souls and power to me. Although this is only one of my incarnations after the blood soul sacrifice, its power has increased by 5 times, and it now has 50% of my strength. Long Tian and those ants behind you. Now, do you understand my good intentions? Stop resisting stubbornly. Admit defeat and accept this emperor's judgment. The majestic voice spread throughout the battlefield, and the domineering and majestic aura caused everyone's expression to change. The 10,000 soldiers under the Imperial Tutor's command were overjoyed, and their confidence was restored. Their eyes shone brightly. On the other hand, the Rebel Alliance soldiers were frowning, and their faces were solemn and filled with worry. Only Zhou Xian's expression did not change. He looked at the Azure God Emperor indifferently and said in a cold voice, "It's just a crooked path and it won't last long. Even if this incarnation has 50% of your strength, so what? I will destroy you today and see how much of your so-called 50% strength is fake." The Azure God Emperor frowned and snorted. He waved his sharp black claws and gave the order to attack. "Kill them all, leave no one alive." The Azure God Emperor's order sounded a little strange. The 10,000 soldiers under the Imperial Tutor's command were at a disadvantage. How could they kill the 10,000 soldiers of the Rebel Alliance without leaving a single one alive? It sounded like a fool's dream. However, the Azura God Emperor's incarnation was present, and after the blood soul sacrifice, it had 50% of his strength. This gave the 10,000 soldiers great confidence and courage. Hearing the Azura God Emperor's order, the imperial tutor led the 10,000 soldiers and bravely launched a charge. Xianxia also waved the sword of burial of heaven and pointed it at the Azura God Emperor and his soldiers. He roared, "Kill!" The 10,000 soldiers of the Rebel Alliance immediately roared and waved their swords, and the Kenshin soldiers launched an all-out attack. The fleet led by the god-slaying battleship also released the most violent cannon fire, and launched a fierce bombardment at the Azura Divine Palace. This earth-shattering battle, which could be called the grandest and most spectacular in the past 1,000 years, had finally begun. Hundreds of millions of dazzling divine techniques covered tens of thousands of miles of heaven and earth, causing the area to become colorful and chaotic. Tens of thousands of divine techniques bloomed with dazzling light, bursting with destructive power. They fiercely collided between heaven and earth, and the explosion shook the 9 heavens. Peerlessly violent shockwaves, wrapped in endless fragments of divine light, spread out in all directions, destroying everything. In a short moment, everything within 100,000 miles was reduced to a wasteland and ruins. There was only a lonely Azura Divine Palace left on the battlefield, as well as more than 20,000 soldiers from both sides. They were fighting with their lives on the line. Chapter 4175. On the battlefield, soldiers faced soldiers and generals faced generals. The 15,000 soldiers of the Anti-Rebels League besieged the 10,000 soldiers under Emperor Preceptor's command without any regard for their own safety. The God King experts of the 20 ancient clans and sects engaged in a fierce battle against the 100 or so God Kings under the Imperial Preceptor. Nangong Buhua clan leader Wanyan, Duguzhan, Lan Wuji, Jiang Chuyun, Su Bailian, and the others were all at the 9th level of the God King realm. These 10 clan leaders and sect leaders joined forces to besiege the imperial tutor. Xianxia's target was naturally the strongest person present, the Azura God Emperor. Jiku Yunyao Jiwuhin, and the others also fought bravely on the battlefield. They took care of each other and formed battle formations. They advanced and retreated appropriately, constantly killing batch after batch of the imperial tutor's soldiers. With the protection of a supreme-grade king-grade divine artifact, they were invincible. Apart from a peak god king like the imperial tutor, almost no one could do anything to them. However, the Azura God Emperor was entangled by Xianxia, and the imperial tutor was held back by the 10 clan leaders and sect leaders. He couldn't spare any time to help. Thus, from the very beginning of this great battle, the situation had been one-sided. The 10,000 soldiers under the imperial tutor were slaughtered. They couldn't break through the encirclement of the Rebel Alliance at all. They were forced to retreat continuously, and could only hide in the Azura Divine Palace. Even so, their numbers were greatly reduced and their morale was getting lower and lower. The fleet led by the god-slaying warships continued to bombard the Azura Divine Palace with their cannons. The supreme-grade king-grade divine arrays of the Azura Divine Palace were all activated and operated at full power. With the support of almost endless cultivation resources, the 2 supreme-grade king-grade divine arrays could last for at least a few years. However, the continuous bombardment of the 21 god-slaying warships, the aftershocks of the battle, and the fierce attacks of the 10,000 soldiers were still too much for the 2 arrays to bear. After a quarter of an hour of battle, the first layer of the Azura Divine Palace's defensive array formation began to crack. The defensive power of the array formation had clearly declined. After the battle lasted for 45 minutes, about 5,000 of the 10,000 soldiers under the imperial tutor's command had been killed. Of the 5,000 survivors, they were also severely wounded. They retreated into the Azura Divine Palace, not daring to rush out again. They relied on the defensive array formation of the Azura Divine Palace to tenaciously resist the attacks of the Rebel Alliance, trying to stall for time. With just the few of them, it was impossible for them to win. The imperial tutor was also besieged by the 10 clan leaders and clan masters. He was badly wounded and could barely take care of himself. It was impossible for him to turn the situation around. Hence, the 5,000 soldiers placed all their hopes of turning the tables on Emperor God Xiaoluo. At this time the Shura God Emperor and Ji Tianqing had exchanged tens of thousands of blows in the sky. The heavenly grotto was already riddled with holes and was on the verge of collapse. They had already moved 500,000 miles away from the battlefield. The sky of this 500,000 miles was filled with pitch-black cracks and holes in the void. One could clearly see the stars in the sky. Terrifying void turbulence and storms poured into the heavenly grotto from these cracks and holes, wreaking havoc everywhere. The mountains, rivers, and forests within the heavenly grotto were destroyed and annihilated by the void storms. Even though the will of heavenly Tao was slowly repairing the cracks and holes in the void, it could not keep up with the speed of destruction. Therefore, the Azura God Emperor's heavenly grotto would soon shatter and completely disintegrate. As for Ji Tianqing and the Azura God Emperor, they had already left the heavenly grotto and moved to the void. 4 powerhouses of their realm and level, it was no longer suitable for them to fight in the divine world. No matter where they were in the divine world, as long as they fought with all their strength, the heavens and earth would shatter and space would collapse, creating a great disaster. Only the vast and boundless void was suitable for them to fight. In the void millions of miles away from the divine world, Ji Tianqing and the Azura God Emperor's avatar were facing each other in the void. Separated by tens of thousands of miles, the two stared at each other, locking onto each other's aura, but neither acted rashly. Before this, the two had already exchanged tens of thousands of blows and exhausted a great deal of their divine power. At this time, the two of them were silently adjusting their breathing and treating their injuries. That's right, both of them had suffered heavy injuries. Ji Tianqing's white robe was already tattered and stained with golden blood. His long hair was also disheveled and there were more than 20 wounds on his body. Half of them were so deep that his bones could be seen. However, he was expressionless as if he did not feel pain and did not even frown. He held the divine hammer in his left hand, which was surrounded by purple lightning, and the sword of burial of heaven in his right hand. The blade was stained with purple blood and flickered with dark red flames. The purple blood naturally belonged to the Azura God Emperor's avatar. The 10,000 feet tall Azura God Emperor's avatar was also hunched over and panting heavily. His thick and muscular arms as well as his bulging chest and back had more than 10 crisscrossing wounds. It was a ghastly sight. 2 of the 6 Azura wings on his back had also been pierced, and purple blood flowed continuously. At this time he had used a secret skill that temporarily increased his combat strength. His entire body was surrounded by purple flames and a layer of dark red killing intent. The two of them had fought for so long and both of them had won and lost. Their injuries were also similar and neither of them had the upper hand. This result was within Ji Tianqing's expectations, but it was beyond the Azura God Emperor's expectations. His face was ferocious and his eyes were cold as he stared at Ji Tianqing. He said in a low voice, "Longtian, how many years has it been since you came back from the dead? Not only have you returned to the peak of the Divine King realm, but you are also several times stronger than before. Such rapid growth is truly unbelievable." Before this, the Azura God Emperor already knew that Ji Tianqing had killed several God Emperor's avatars. After all, these God Emperors' true bodies were in the depths of the void, surrounded by the gray fog. They maintained contact with each other, especially when facing a common enemy like the Kenshin. Naturally, they would exchange information. Therefore, before the Azura God Emperor returned to the divine world, he did not underestimate Ji Tianqing in the slightest. He originally thought that after the blood soul sacrifice, his avatar's strength would increase by 4 to 5 times, and he would have the confidence to kill Ji Tianqing. But now he realized that Ji Tianqing's growth was terrifying. It was obvious that he was several times stronger than before he returned to the divine world. This left the Azura God Emperor with no choice but to consider a question. "Longtian, I have no choice but to consider this carefully. What kind of treasure in this world could allow you to grow so quickly?" The Azura God Emperor stared coldly at Ji Tianqing, and his lips curled into a meaningful smile. What kind of supreme divine weapon, elixir, or medicine could have such an effect? My guess is that only the heaven-punishing formation, which is on par with the eternal heavenly book, could have such a heaven-defying effect? Ha ha ha, you may be able to hide it from others but you cannot hide it from me. The heaven-punishing formation must be in your hands, right? Chapter 4176. to everyone in the world. Supreme quality king-level divine artifacts, divine pills, techniques and materials were the ultimate treasures. Many peak god kings thought so as well. But to the 5 god emperors, they were used to seeing supreme quality king-level divine artifacts a long time ago. The eternal heavenly scripture and the heaven-punishing formation were divine artifacts that clearly surpassed the god-king level and could communicate with and control the power of the heavenly Tao. They were the ultimate treasures they dreamed of. Of course, besides these 2 divine artifacts of unknown origin, there was also the gray mist in the depths of the void, which was fatally attractive to them. At present, the 5 god emperors were most concerned about these 3 things. Apart from these dynasties, billions of resources and riches were all just floating clouds. Because at the 5 god emperors' level of strength they pursued different things. They had long since surpassed the gods and reigned above all living beings. What they pursued was not wealth, power, fame or status. They wanted to live as long as the heavens, coexist with the heavenly Tao and even control it. They wanted eternal life, to control the power of the heavenly Tao, to rule the universe and become the most supreme being. The eternal heavenly scripture could only help them surpass the God-King level and take that final step into the so-called God-Emperor level. It was like a key that helped them open the door to the heavenly Tao, allowing them to step into a new realm and use and control a sliver of the power of the heavenly Tao. But it was very difficult for them to take the next step and become immortal and live as long as the heavens. As for controlling the heavenly Tao, that was even more difficult. Thus, the 5 God Emperors had long ago come to a conclusion. To achieve these goals, they had to find the heaven-punishing formation. Either the heaven-punishing formation could help them achieve their goals, or the heaven-punishing formation and the eternal heavenly scripture could work together. In short, they had to find the heaven-punishing formation. But the 5 God Emperors had done everything they could to search the God world and the various star zones, but to no avail. The god of the underworld had even gone to great lengths to support the heaven-punishing race in the lower world and help him search for the heaven-punishing formation. In the end, the 5 God Emperors had failed to obtain the heaven-punishing formation. This was because the heaven-punishment formation had always been in Ji Tianxing's hands. Hearing Shura God Emperor's words, Ji Tianxing used the same trick he used against the god of the underworld in the past. His face was full of astonishment and he asked doubtfully, "Shura, what did you say? The heaven-punishing formation. Isn't it in your hands? You 5 bastards killed me back then, stole the heaven-vanquishing formation, and used the eternal heavenly scripture to break through to the God Emperor realm. Am I wrong?" Ji Tianxing's performance was very realistic. He expressed his astonishment, shock, ecstasy, and relief very subtly. The Azura God Emperor was also stunned for a moment, and he regretted saying the wrong thing. However, his willpower was unyielding and he quickly regained his composure. He stared at Ji Tianxing and sneered, "Long Tian, stop acting in front of this emperor. You might be able to fool the netherworld with this little trick, but you can't fool this emperor." Clearly, the god of the underworld's clone had a similar conversation with Ji Tianxing. The god of the underworld had also mentioned this to the other god emperors. The god of the underworld had told the other 4 that he had tested the waters and was basically sure that the heaven punishment formation was not in Kenshin's hands. However, the Azura God Emperor did not agree, and he still suspected that the heaven punishment formation was in Kenshin's hands. However, he did not have any conclusive evidence, so he could only suspect. And now he was testing him in person. Unfortunately, Ji Tianxing was already prepared and he did not reveal any flaws. The Azura God Emperor stared at him and continued to ask, "When you first appeared in the God realm, your identity was first exposed and it was only a few decades ago. Coincidentally, you were on the boundless heaven continent at that time, and you had just recovered to the Divine King realm. In just a few short decades, not only have you recovered to the peak of the Divine King realm, but you are also 8 times stronger than before. Tell me, other than the eternal heavenly book and the heaven punishment formation, what other treasure could have such heaven-defying effects?" If the eternal heavenly book was in the hands of the 5 God Emperors, then there could only be one answer. Ji Tianxing had relied on the heaven punishment formation to create such a miracle. Therefore the Azura God Emperor did not doubt it. Although this was one of the truths, Ji Tianxing would never admit it. Otherwise, he could not be sure whether the 5 God Emperors would temporarily give up on the mystery of the grey fog and join forces to attack him for the sake of the heaven punishment formation. Given his current strength, if he were to be attacked by the 5 God Emperors again, he would undoubtedly die. Azura, I thought you had taken the heaven punishment formation. Now it seems that you only have the eternal heavenly book. The heavens are indeed fair and have favored me by not letting you bastards have the formation. The Azura God Emperor frowned and laughed contemptuously. Enough. Long Tian, do you take me for a fool? Do you still want to keep up the act? Ji Tianxing laughed coldly as well. If you think the heaven punishment formation is in my hands, then what are you waiting for? Why don't you risk your life to take it? If I have the heaven punishment formation, I will soon break through to the God Emperor realm and even surpass you. When that happens, it will be your time to die. Azura, tell the other 4 bastards to wash their necks and wait for death. Before this, the Azura God Emperor had still firmly believed that the heaven punishment formation was in his hands. However, after hearing what he said, Emperor God Xiu Luo hesitated. He frowned and stared at Ji Tianxing, carefully observing Ji Tianxing's eyes and subtle reactions to see if he was lying. Could it be that the heaven punishment formation is really not in your hands? Then where would it be hidden? You were clearly killed by us, so how could you come back from the dead and gain such strength in just a short 100 years? Ji Tianxing pointed at the endless void above his head and said with a playful smile, as the saying goes, the worthy are blessed by the heavens. You are evil spirits who commit all kinds of evil, and the heavens will not tolerate you. But I am the embodiment of justice and light, the representative of the heavens, so the heavens especially favor me. If the heavens don't want me to die, how could I die? Also, only I can swear an oath to the heavens and use it to restrain the powerhouses. You 5 bastards, which one of you can swear an oath on behalf of the heavens? This. The Azura God Emperor hesitated even more, and his face became very ugly. His eyes darted back and forth and hundreds of thoughts flashed through his mind. He had to admit that Ji Tianxing was favored by the heavens, and it was very likely that he was the favored child of the heavens. It sounded very reasonable. Otherwise, how could he come back from the dead? How could he explain that he could swear an oath to the heavens to restrain the powerhouses of the immortal kings? After all, the Azura God Emperor had long heard that all the domain lords and ancient clan leaders who surrendered and pledged their loyalty to the Kenshin had to swear an oath of surrender. The key was that those long oaths were indeed witnessed and bound by the heavens. The Azura God Emperor had also asked the imperial tutor to collect a few oaths of surrender and personally read the contents of the oaths. That's right, it was an oath to the heavens. Now that he heard Ji Tianxing admit it to his face, the Azura God Emperor's mood became even more complicated. Rather than believe that Ji Tianxing had the heaven punishment formation in his hands, he felt that the seemingly absurd reason of Kenshin is the embodiment of the heavens was more believable. Book Guest House Reading Website. You're tuning in to the Zhou Xian's Legacy YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.